Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I hope you are all doing well. Welcome to lecture 2 or lesson 2 or whatever we're referring to this as of the series we're doing on nihilism with the Sapience Institute. My name is Yusuf Ponders. I'm just going to do a quick audio check. Can you just let me know in the chat, I guess, or somewhere? Maybe your questions, that you can all hear me fine and you can see me. And once I get a thumbs up from you guys, yes, okay, alhamdulillah. So we shall begin with me. And can you just let me know that you can see the screen? I think you can. I'm still getting used to this software, so inshallah, I'm using it properly. Yes, okay, alhamdulillah. All right, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So again, we're going into lecture 2. So for those of you who missed lecture 1 or are interested in seeing that, inshallah, I did speak to Hamza just before this webinar started to ask him when that's going on. And he said it should be going up on the website, so that's sapiensinstitute.org, and also on the Sapience Institute YouTube channel. And that should be available, hopefully, inshallah, within the next week. Obviously, the sooner the better. It just depends on circumstances, which are unfortunately beyond my control. So that happens when it happens. But inshallah, it shouldn't be too long. And again, with all of these, they will be going up on the channel and onto the website, along with lecture slide notes and things like that. So you should have access to all of these if you want to kind of rewatch them, or even just have a look through the lecture slides so you can take notes again. But other than that, let us continue. So I'm just going to hide this. Right, so for those of you who don't know me, I went through this a little bit in the first one, so I'll just quickly go through it now. My name is Yusuf Ponders. I have a YouTube channel, which is Pondering Soul. You can check my website out as well, ponderingsoul.blog. And if you're searching for me on social media, be that Twitter or Facebook, don't use any of the other platforms. You can find me by searching at Yusuf Ponders and follow me on there. With regards to myself, so my background is in philosophy. So I've got a BA in philosophy specifically with a focus on nihilism, which was the subject of my dissertation, and also with ethics, philosophy of religion, a few other bits and bobs on that. And we did a series, that was me and brother Sabor Ahmed from Darwinian Delusions, also a member of the Sapience Institute, going over my dissertation with basically section by section. There's a playlist on my YouTube channel, so if you go to Pondering Soul, go to the playlist section, you will see a playlist there on nihilism, and it's basically me and him just kind of going through the theme of each section of my dissertation and then having a discussion and a back and forth with that. It was very well received. I had a lot of positive feedback about it. People kind of dealing with these sort of issues found it to be quite helpful. The dissertation was also given as further reading on the advertisement for this on the Sapience Institute website. So you may have already been directed to it there. And then there is another article that I wrote specifically for the Sapience Institute, which you'll find on sapiensinstitute.org. It's basically on this subject, on the focus of nihilism, and then moving into a discussion on Islam as an antidote to that. This is part 1 that I've done, and part 2 is going to be hopefully done by about May-ish, inshallah. And I sort of start to transition in the end of part 1 towards the idea of Islam as an antidote to nihilism, and the part 2 is really going to hone into that particular idea, inshallah. So yeah, you can check that out. I'm also currently applying for a master's, so I can continue my education in philosophy as well. They're just in the process of trying to get funding for that. So that's enough about me. Just a recap. So last week we did what is nihilism, and we gave a special focus on definitions with regards to what meaning is and what nihilism is. And we went through the process of, well, what is the meaning of meaning, which was quite a weird question to ask, and we sort of cover that. And in short, we have this sort of precognitive understanding of what meaning is. We engage constantly with the world in a meaningful way, and we can't help escape it. Everything, like our engagements, are just flooded with meaning, and we're constantly being presented with meaningful things. So it's a part of our being. It's unescapable. And then we move on to asking questions about, well, what do we mean then when we talk about the meaning of life? When we talk about whether or not life has a purpose, and so on and so forth. And then we moved on finally into a more in-depth definition of nihilism with reference to philosophers like Nietzsche. And hopefully, inshallah, that should have prepared you or given you at least a sort of introductory insight into what nihilism is exactly. We're dealing with the purpose of life and things kind of surrounding that. Now, today's lecture is going to be focusing on the potential causes for nihilism and threats for meaning. And then in the 2 weeks following this, we're going to look at the consequences of nihilism. So when nihilism has arrived, what happens, or what sort of reasoning the people use when they are sort of embedded in a nihilist state of being, and they're quite inclined to nihilistic conclusions. What are those conclusions? What kind of things does it lead to? And then lecture 4 is going to be an insight into Islam as a potential antidote to nihilism, which will be the focus of the upcoming essay. And this is basically going to be a sort of an introductory, or lecture 4 will be an introductory sort of insight into what you can expect to find in the upcoming essay part 2 on this particular subject. So the aim for today, like I say, is to explore what causes nihilism, and so it's broken up into 2 parts. The first part is to explore Nietzsche's approach, and there's 2 sections here. We've got pessimism as a prototype, so we're going to discuss the idea of the state of being of pessimism as being a precursor for the following experience of a nihilistic outlook. And then we're also going to look at the idea that he puts forward as well of the higher values undermining themselves, and how this is important to Nietzsche's conception of nihilism and how it arrives. And then part 2 is going to be exploring threats to meaning, and we're going to be doing this by kind of having a look specifically at the work of a particular philosopher of education. And his work is, like I say, his focus is philosophy of education, and he really hones in on that for the purpose of showing how meaning is important in education. But he has a section, or he says a little bit on that with regards to nihilism, or with regards to threats to meaning, because he sees this as important. Obviously, if you're trying to facilitate meaning in education, threats to that are obviously importance. And so he points out 4 particular things that he sees as threats to meaning, and they are the spirit of criticism and skepticism, industrialization and alienation, overwhelming overabundance, and rapid rates of change. So we're going to explore them as well in a little more detail, so you can get an idea of what kind of things going to sort of lead to this sort of outcome, that is nihilism. And you will also see how, in a certain way, that the sort of this societal cloud of nihilism, as you could put it, maybe, is sort of inevitable with the modern predicament. The modern society facilitates nihilism, and so you will see everyone sort of experiencing it on some level, whether that being personally, if not now, maybe later, or through somebody they know, or through pop culture. You'll be seeing it all over the place. All over the internet and online and things like that. So we'll begin with part 1, which is to explore Nietzsche's approach, and we'll look at section A, pessimism as a prototype. So Nietzsche just outright specifically refers to it in The Will to Power, Aphorism 9. He says pessimism as a prototype. of nihilism. And by prototype, we basically mean the first original or typical form of something, an archetype. And so pessimism here is seen as sort of the gateway, or the the original form that nihilism takes. So maybe you could look at it as, say, the seed for the flower, if you want to refer to it as that, of nihilism. And specifically with a definition of pessimism, we're looking at a tendency to see the worst aspect of things, or believe that the worst will happen. Philosophical definition of that is a belief that this world is as bad as it could be, or that evil will ultimately prevail over good. And you can see here that these are synonymous with these particular words. So it's a defeatism, negative thinking or negativity, and expecting the worst. You'll notice here that this is a state of mind. This is a hopeless state of being, and it's not necessarily expressive of, if you want to refer to it as quote unquote objective fact. So it's not necessarily the case that any of this is true. When someone is suffering from pessimism, or is a pessimist, or considers themselves a pessimist, obviously there's arguments in favor of it, but it's in no way conclusive that this is the case. But nonetheless, when someone is feeling pessimistic, it's difficult to sort of necessarily rationalize them out of that. Sometimes it's just a case of circumstances. A number of bad things have happened to them, and this has knocked their emotional state of being and put them into a bad place, and affects how they see the world moving forward and looking into the future. But it implies a sort of subjectivity in the fundamental interpretation of the world, insofar as if pessimism is the prototype of nihilism, or pessimism is that gateway that leads to nihilism. What we're in a way saying here is that there is some sort of underpinning with regards to a subjective experience leading to this outlook, leading to a nihilistic outlook. And maybe people are aware of that when they're suffering from it. Maybe some of them are not. But this is how Nietzsche is sort of putting it forward. And ultimately, it's an admittance, whether consciously or unconsciously, that it's the taking of a negative stance prior to evaluation. So you are a pessimist in general, or you have a certain state of being at the time, and then you begin to evaluate the world through the lens of pessimism, and then obviously this is affecting the outcome of your evaluation to some degree. Now a few more quotes. I do love my quotes, and then I won't just read them one after the other. Obviously I'll give a little commentary on each of them as we go. So here it's another aphorism from the same book, The Will to Power, just to kind of give you an insight into what this book is. So Nietzsche wrote a lot of books throughout his time. A famous quote of him was that he didn't have enough time to write a little. And so he was a prolific writer. He spent a lot of time in isolation, on his own, in the mountains, and out of the way. And he was quite a lonely person, and he suffered from this loneliness. And I guess you could say one of the ways he would sort of deal with this is he would just write constantly and a lot. And there's many books that he published, but when he lost his mind, in the last 10 years of his life, he was looked after by his sister, and I think in part by his mother as well. And he didn't get on with them at all prior to his losing his mind. But they did look after him, and his sister was responsible for collecting his notes and basically publishing some of his unpublished work. And the Will to Power is one of these books. So The Will to Power is a collection of his notes, which were supposed to be sort of a guideline for this ultimate book that he wanted to release. So he had this plan for his final crescendo, his ultimate finishing writing. And the Antichrist, which is the last book he wrote, was supposed to be a chapter in that book, but he never got to finish it. And so what his sister did was she used his notes to sort of build a new book, a book of his notes. And The Will to Power is one of these, and it's just a collection of them. And so here, and he was very known for writing in aphorism form, which are basically like short, comprehensive quotes. So you just have these paragraphs, and he just fills his books with them. There was one that he wrote that was more of like a story, which is called "Thus Spoke Zarathustra." I can never say that word. And that took this form of like a story and narrative of a character going through some sort of like adventure. But that wasn't common for him. He didn't usually write in that way. You would usually find him writing like this in aphorisms. And so here he's talking again on pessimism. So he says, this is our point of departure. And he talks of pessimism expressing itself in two ways, either as a sign of strength or as a sign of decline. And then he says, but in what respect? Pessimism may be regarded as a sign of strength, but in what respect? In the power of its logic and analysis, or when it takes the form of anarchistic and nihilistic tendencies. So here he's saying that you can consider pessimism as a sign of strength insofar as it is anarchistic. So when we're saying anarchistic here, we're talking in the sense of a sort of revolutionary ideal, or this sort of highly anarchy obviously is the chaos incarnate. It wants to sort of destroy the accepted order of things, and nihilistic tendencies. And he even referred to himself as a philosopher with a hammer. And so he would philosophize like a hammer would. He would just sort of smash things apart. That was what he refers to himself as doing best. And so he sees that as pessimism being regarded as a sign of strength. However, he says pessimism may also be regarded as a sign of decline. But in what respect? When it seems to be the result of pampering, of cosmopolitan dilettantism, of historicism, and of effort to decomprendere. The critical tensions, the extremes appear and become predominant. So just to kind of help anyone that's not really familiar with these terms. So cosmopolitan basically is just referring to sort of a multicultural place. So it's including people from many different countries. And dilettantism is someone who cultivates an area of interest such as the art without real commitment or knowledge. And then with tot de comprendre, however you say that, is French, meaning basically understand everything. So here, when it's regarded as a sign of decline, what he's saying is the result of a pampering. So for example, when you see a lot of these very successful, very rich people, they've had everything, that you could ever think of wanting, they have it. And the layperson might even look up at them and say, imagine you had all that. I'd be the happiest person in the world. It's a common trope you hear from the average person when they talk about, if I won the lottery, there's no way I'd be depressed. There's no way I'd be sad. There's no way this, no way that. But it's not necessarily that true. You see it as a very common issue among those with a lot of wealth, or having been pampered a lot, that they do have a lot of suffering as the result of that, and they may even become pessimistic. Once you have everything, there's not really that much to be excited for. Whereas at least when you don't have much, the simplest things can bring you much joy. Whereas if you always have whatever you want at the click of a finger, there's never any effort required to sort of achieve anything. And so this can result in a sort of a pessimism in life as a result of that, and again as a sign of decline. So with regards to cosmopolitan dilettantism, that is the multicultural sort of interest in things without real commitment on knowledge, you just really have to think of the general social media presence, or just modern society. So you have cosmopolitan, you can think of it as a sort of a consequence of secularism, with adding on top of that this idea of multiculturalism and a flattening of the value playing field. So all cultures are completely equal. We need to sort of see them all in the same way. But obviously, if you believe one thing and you see everything else as false or in comparison to that, this ends up causing a bit of a problem. And so you end up with this sort of attitude, and you see it very much in public schooling, where everything, although it used to be valued when it was not part of a cosmopolitan society by the people that hold it, you get this thing happening where everything just ends up being seen as equally false or equally fictional. So when teachers are teaching about all these different religions, they obviously don't believe in all of them, and the religion itself and things like that, it's not taken very seriously as a result of all of this, and it's quite a common thing. But yeah, so he's seeing this as a sort of precursor again for pessimism as a sign of decline. There's so much information out there. People have like this general interest in many things, but they're not necessarily interested in it in the sense that they want to become masters of specific things, but rather the jack of all trades. And you can see this manifest itself as a pessimism, as a sign of decline. And then the historicism, which is basically just kind of focus on a historical progress as being the main part of human development, and an effort to the comprendre, that is the effort to try to understand everything, an effort to really try to encompass the almost uncompassable. So you look out into the universe, and there's just so much information that is there to be mined, to be sifted through, to be processed. And anyone who's sort of maybe this is a common feeling for individuals, not just societies, but when you look at, or when you start to study and you look at how much there is to learn in the world, all the different religions, all of the different moral systems, in terms of ethics, the amount of literature that's just been written in philosophy alone is ridiculous. The amount of history there is to know, all of these different countries, all these different peoples with different things that have occurred. And someone might feel like, well, in order to really get what's going on, I need to understand this whole process, the history of human development in its totality from beginning to the present and moving on into the future. But this, especially for one person, it's an impossible task, and it results in this sort of cosmopolitan dilettantism, in the sense that you end up having, by necessity, because you're trying to be interested in everything, you end up not really giving much commitment to anything. You spread yourself too thin, and it can sort of lead to this pessimism in the sense that you don't really see much hope in ever really getting the full picture or ever coming to understand anything. But he says this is the pessimism is seen as a sign of decline. And then this final sentence here, he says, the critical tension, the extremes appear and become predominant. So I guess we can look at this and try to interpret it. The extremes appear and become predominant. It is possible here he's referring to the extremes of pessimism as strength and pessimism as decline. So maybe we can look at this in a way of a portion of society is pessimistic in a strong way, and then another portion is pessimistic in a weak or in a declining way. And so he's saying that they both become present and both become predominant, and so you end up with this very strong presence of anarchism or of nihilistic tendencies. And you do see that with the rise of organizations or groups. You get like Antifa, for example. It's in the name. They are quite anarchistic by nature, and the popularity that in university, for example, I knew a lot of people that were in favor of anarchism, or they liked the idea, or saw that this anarchism was a way of sort of introducing some sort of utopia. There is definitely a presence of this here, and there is you see it especially in the modern activism. You see it in the Middle East as well. So when you had the Arab Spring, this was quite anarchistic in its nature to a certain degree. And you see the results of a lot of that in many places in the Middle East, where you just have this sort of destruction of the systems that were in place, and there was nothing really set up to replace it, and so you just end up with chaos, with anarchy. And so you can argue here that this form of pessimism, as Nietzsche's putting it, as being something anarchistic and nihilistic in its tendencies, is predominant, or it's on its way to being that. and with its opposite as well. So you have this pampering, especially with the modern Western world. You have this cosmopolitan dilettantism, and the effort to try to understand everything. And so this creates a critical tension, which leads to a sort of nihilism. And so he says here that the logic of pessimism leads ultimately to nihilism. But what motivates it? The notion that everything is worthless, meaningless, the way that moral judgments lie behind all of the high ideals. The result? Moral value judgments are condemnations, repudiations, and morality is a renunciation of the will to live. Now, so this particular character, he had some very, very controversial views, and that this isn't an argument in favor of them. So we're not trying to say that he's right here. We're just trying to keep in mind the whole point of this particular lecture is to try to understand the type of thinking that leads to it. So he's saying here the logic of pessimism. Now, there's a number of axioms that are sort of being accepted here. And then what you can say, if you accept these particular axioms and then you move forward and reason from these axioms and you move towards an end, if you're pessimistic and you look at the world in such a way and you're not very hopeful with the end of things, then in this case, you could say that it ultimately leads to nihilism. Now, this isn't necessarily wrong. If you accept that if these axioms are accepted, that leads to it. It doesn't mean you have to accept those axioms or the propositions that are being put forward with regards to, for example, a pessimistic outlook on life. But so he says here, but what motivates it? The notion that everything is worthless, meaningless. Again, keep in mind these are conscious attributes. So these are the attributes of something conscious. To look at something as whether it's with regards to its value, is it worth something or is it worthless? To look at things in terms of their meaning or the purpose of things. These are conscious processes. And so to look at something, to see it as worthless or meaningless, this is the experience of some human being, of people in general, when they're looking at and engaging with the world and trying to understand their relation to it in some way. And then he goes on to say that all moral judgments lie behind all of the high ideals. So, for example, the valuing of truth that you see with people like Richard Dawkins, they talk about it a lot. We can have an argument and discussion or debate about whether or not they do actually value it that much. But they make this claim: we value truth. We value truth. And the question is why do you value truth? Why, is truth necessarily? Obviously we're coming here just from a quote unquote secular perspective. Why is truth valuable in and of itself? Can you not conceive of moments where truth might be detrimental, or a damage, or something that might not necessarily be something that a group of people would want to achieve? So, for example, the US government. There are certain things that they have done, and you see this with the expression of things like WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, all of these characters, and they are in possession of particular truths. Now, the US government doesn't necessarily feel it's in the best interest for all of these truths to be completely revealed. It might undermine the government, things like that. And obviously that's an extreme example, but you can foresee how, for particular groups of people or for particular clumps, that truth can be detrimental to some way. Truth can be something that leads to anarchy, that leads to a collapse of a particular system, of a particular society. And there's many examples we can go through, but in total, from a secular perspective, or from a sort of agnostic position, you can consider of times or of things where truth wouldn't necessarily be something that everyone would value. And Nietzsche, he goes into this in his writing. He talks about it in an essay called On Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense. He makes these observations that they value truth only insofar as it's something of value to them, or that it leads to something of value, or that it's practical. Insofar as it becomes damaging or dangerous, they disregard truth. and you find this with people in general, with societies as well, and large, that there's not always truth that are necessarily things that should be valued. Truths are a complicated thing. There's a lot of nuance here, and some of them can be detrimental. And so with this, the truth as a higher value itself is revealed as a moral judgment. Truth is only valued insofar as it's seen as good, necessarily. But half of the reason, or a very large portion of the reason, Nietzsche argues that truth in Europe or in the Western society is of value at all, is because this is, as he sees it, baggage that has been brought over from a Christian moral system. That is, within the Bible, there was a lot of emphasis on being truthful, and this valuing it now, and science in general, he sees that as the sort of the corpse or the remains of the death of Christianity. So he doesn't see science as this thing that rose in competition with Christianity, that beat it as sort of like two combatants. No, he sees science as sort of the rotting corpse. So he's very good with his imagery. He refers to science as like the rotting corpse of the Christian moral system, and the fact that people are not able to even see that anymore, he says, shows the really deep-rooted hold that this moral system has on the people. And so they don't even see morality as a problem yet, simply because they can't see why they value the things that they value. They don't see that this is cultural baggage, that this is something inherited over a long period of time, and that there are arguments here. If you lose faith in God and you lose your tradition, that there is no necessary reason to value truth at all. That there are very good arguments that if you accept all of these axioms, if you incline towards disbelief, that you could value many other things. And he sort of offers a sort of creative approach to all of this. But obviously, we're going to get into this in a bit more in a moment. But so Friedrich Nietzsche, he was very heavily influenced by another philosopher that came before him called Arthur Schopenhauer. And Arthur Schopenhauer was very famous for being a pessimistic philosopher. And so much so he wrote studies on pessimism. And we're going to go into them a little bit. But these are sort of the cool guys in pessimistic philosophy, or the how do you word them? They're the go-to philosophers when people are trying to understand this type of thinking. And Schopenhauer himself was critiqued enough about his pessimistic way of life that he even made a response to it, which when you read it, sort of brings across this Matrix 5, a scene where he holds the two pills out to Neo. And so he says, "I shall be told, I suppose, that my philosophy is comfortless because I speak the truth, and people prefer to be assured that everything the Lord made is good. Go to the priests, then, and leave philosophers in peace." And so, obviously, with this, his philosophy is very pessimistic. It's not very hopeful. And people can and do get very depressed when they read the type of work that these people put forward. And so he's pointing out that truth itself can hurt. And funnily enough, this is something even the types like Richard Dawkins or Harris will admit. Sometimes the truth isn't always nice to hear. And this echoes this sense that truth can be detrimental to some degree. It can be destructive. It can be danger to even people's state of mind or state of being. Truth has in many cases led people even to commit suicide. So it's is truth good? There's a huge debate that can be had on this. Obviously, it's not to say that it isn't, and that we should all live a fantasy. But there is nuance. That there is arguments to be made that in some cases, in some contexts, truth can be dangerous, damaging, not something that people might want to hear or want to know about or want to reveal. And in other cases, obviously, it's going to be very beneficial. And so you've got to keep that in mind when you think on this subject. So this is a quote from Schopenhauer's Studies in Pessimism. And he says, "In early youth, as we contemplate our coming life, we are like children in a theatre before the curtain is raised, sitting there in high spirits and eagerly waiting for the play to begin." So this section here, this paints us as, and it also explains the precursor, I guess, for pessimism as being optimism. So in your youth, you've got, well, you see all of life ahead of you. You've got nothing but excitement for, when I grow up, this is, the world is going to be open to me. The things that I will try to achieve, maybe, they want to, even the modern day child talks about wanting to go to Mars. I want to be the first person to go to Mars. I want to be an astronaut. I want to be a singer. The imagination of the youth can take them to such high places, to point their goals and aims so high that it fills them with an ecstasy of sorts. And this is characteristic of them being extremely optimistic. Now it says then, it is a blessing that we do not know what is really going to happen. So reality kicks in at some point, and this has a huge effect on this optimism, and it completely transforms it to, I guess you could say, its opposite. And so, the optimism, he's arguing here, is the consequence of this naive ignorance. And then when reality hits and the optimism has to synchronize and process reality, what happens is the optimism is transformed and becomes its opposite. So he says, it is a blessing that we do not know what's really going to happen. Could we force it? There are times when children might seem like innocent prisoners, condemned not to death, but to life, and as yet all unconscious of what their sentence means. So you can see here this echo of this very, very negative outlook on life. So keep in mind the definition that we gave of pessimism. You can see that these people, when they're writing, when they're talking, they are looking at the world. They've been affected by whatever's going on around them, and they take this very, very low opinion of the world. And it definitely shines through in their writing. And this man again was a huge influence on Nietzsche and the work that he wrote. So he says here, again, you may look upon life as an unprofitable episode, disturbing the blessed calm of non-existence. And in any case, even though things have gone with you tolerably well, the longer you live, the more clearly you will feel, on the whole, that life is a disappointment, nay, a cheat. And the theme is simple here. The theme is that life is hard, that it's full of suffering, and and to some degree, those who sort of come to this conclusion and argue in the fashion that's being argued here may even come to the conclusion that it's contemptible for many reasons. Obviously, some people try to overcome this some way. Unfortunately, not everyone is able to do that. But this is regards to the strength of will that they have. And people have it in varying degrees. And so people with a weak strength with regards to their will won't necessarily be able to overcome it. Those with a strong will may be able to make something out of this. But obviously, if you're a pessimist, you're probably going to look at that in a way that says that most people are not going to be able to overcome it. But again, so this is the general theme. Life is hard. It's full of suffering. And it's something that this is the reality of it. And so he says here, if you accustom yourself to this life, you will regulate your expectations accordingly and cease to look upon all its disagreeable incidents, great and small, its sufferings, its worries, its misery, as anything unusual or irregular. Nay, you will find that everything is as it should be, in a world where each of us pays the penalty of existence in his own peculiar way. So here again, life, if you just submit to the reality of it, you should also not simply do that and expect things ought to be another way. There is no, it ought to be better, or it ought to be this, it ought to be that. No, everything is as it should be, and you need to regulate your expectations accordingly. And so, when you start to read Schopenhauer, and if you ever read Nietzsche, you will see this theme bleeding through Schopenhauer into Nietzsche. And then this really works as stepping stones, and influenced him in terms of his idea of pessimism being a prototype for nihilism, and being fundamental to the whole concept itself. Now, moving on to the next section with regards to the higher values undermining themselves. So the first questions we've got to ask here is, well, what are values? And then what do we mean by higher values? So a value, the definition, it's always good to start with definitions, just kind of clarify the what we're moving on from. So a value is with regards to something that is held to deserve the importance, worth, or usefulness of something. And it's also understood as principles or standards of behavior, one's judgment of what is important in life. So now when we're talking about higher values, values themselves are already things that are considered important, and higher values are those which are considered, I guess, the most important. So if you have a hierarchy of them, they're the ones that are going to be at the top of that pyramid, and they're going to be up there so much so that they're going to be considered things that should be universal. They're valued so highly that a society should adopt them wholesale, and if anyone isn't adopting them, that they are somehow deficient in some way, or they're lacking. And so, obviously, societies have different higher values. A modern European society might have very different higher values than, say, a traditional village in the middle of Africa, or in the middle of India, or in the middle of China, or anywhere in the world, or an Inuit nomad tribe that travels across the plains of the North tundra. All of these groups, they have higher values, things that they consider extremely important, so much so that everyone within their group should accept them. And if they see these higher values being reflected in other communities that they interact with, they would see that as admirable. Or if they see the opposite, or the negation of that higher value in another society, they might find that contemptible in some way. So I guess the question here is, well, how do the higher values undermine themselves? So we've already gave the example of truth briefly, so we'll go into that in a bit more detail. So Nietzsche, he uses the example of truth as well. And another quote from this particular book, he says, but among the virtues cultivated by morality was truthfulness. In the end, it is this which turns us against morality and discovers its function, its partiality. At this point, our insight acts as a stimulant to nihilism. So here, as I said earlier, so valuing truth, as far as Nietzsche could see in Western society, was the consequence and the result of the Christian moral system in the West. Now, you could say, to a particular degree, that this insight that he's saying, so in the end, it is that which turns us against morality and discovers its function, its partiality. Now, there's an ethical system referred to as moral relativism. So my understanding of this particular quote so moral relativism could be broken into two parts. You've got DMR, which is descriptive moral relativism, and you have MMR, which is meta-ethical moral relativism. Now, it's important to understand the difference between the two of these, as the first one, so DMR, descriptive moral relativism, this is basically empirical observation. So it's not making any meta-ethical claims. It's not trying to convince you of what you ought to do or how you ought to act. It's not talking about what good is, what bad is, or anything like that. DMR, descriptive moral relativism, is exactly that. It's a description of what the anthropologists discover. So they go out into the world, they collect data, they collect evidence, and they look and they say, well, this society has this particular moral system. They think this is good, they think that is bad. And you list it out, and you can sort of map a society's moral principles and see them. And then you go to another society and you map them, and you start to see that there are differences. And some of them are irreconcilable. Some of them cause great tensions. Some of them might overlap. There may be similar principles here and similar principles over there. But it's basically a going out into the world, the studying of the human, I don't know how you want to refer to it, the human experiment, the different collections, the different societies, and noting down what it is they understand about morality. And so descriptive moral relativism is basically pointing out that depending on where you are, depending on what context, what time, what place, what people you're born amongst, this will have an effect on the ethical systems that you're brought up to abide by. And so it recognizes that there is a level of relativism, but it doesn't go far as MMR, the meta-ethical moral relativism, in claiming any sort of knowledge about what good is by definition, or what do we mean by good? Is good something that exists or not? Meta-ethical moral relativism starts to make certain claims, for example, that something is good, and that it's a moral fact to say something is good in this particular context. So, for example, in Western society, monogamy might be seen as a virtue, and polygamy might be seen as something abhorrent. And the meta-ethical moral relativist would say, insofar as you are in the society that believes that monogamy is good and polygamy is bad, then it is a moral fact. It is true. You are making a true moral statement to say that X is immoral in these particular conditions. And it is also a moral fact if you go elsewhere to a place where, say, polygamy is acceptable, to say that it is a moral fact. And so it's making the claim that there are moral truths and that these truths are relative to the society. And so it is making meta-ethical claims. It is talking about the nature of good and what people ought to do. And that you, obviously, if something is morally good in a particular society, then you ought to act that way. And so on. So forth. Obviously, the meta-ethical moral relativism itself has a lot of problems. And we can talk about these. And I think these problems of themselves mean that DMR, or descriptive moral relativism, doesn't necessarily lead to MMR, or meta-ethical moral relativism, but it can, in fact, lead to nihilism. And so this is where he's saying that the insights act as a stimulant. So someone looks at the findings of that are explained in DMR, descriptive moral relativism. You see that there are these different moral systems everywhere you go. Nietzsche lived towards the end of the 19th century, or the end of the 1800s, and so there was a lot of information circulating at that time. You had a lot of colonialism going on. People exploring the globe, many different cultures being discovered, many different lands that were prior, a few centuries before that, unknown. And, there was this effort to understand everything really kicking off. And people were just collecting data, mining the world for information endlessly. And so, you can imagine people looking at this might start to see DMR, or descriptive moral relativism, and they might even get to the point where they look at this and see it as completely arbitrary. Oh, well, this is all pointless. People are just doing this based on whims. Obviously, again, this is coming from a foundation of a lack of belief in God already. So if you see these things and you don't believe in God, then maybe you start to see morality itself as completely arbitrary. Obviously, there may be cases where some people that already believe in God may even lose faith looking at this world. They get confused. There's all these different moral systems. How do we manage this? Now, there are arguments that do overcome this, and obviously they can probably take up a whole lecture on themselves. So we won't dwell on that too much, but inshallah, that is something you're interested in hearing more about. Make note of that or mention it in emails or comments and things like that. And inshallah, maybe we can go into it. But the point is that the person who looks at DMR, they suffer from this sort of arbitrariness, and they look at morality as this silly thing. And so Nietzsche here is arguing that this leads or acts as a stimulant towards nihilism. And obviously the whole endeavor to discover these things was the valuing of truthfulness in the first place. I want to know the truth about this society. I want to know the truth about that society. Now, the thing is, if morality is then undermined, and seen as something arbitrary and silly, if truth is a moral value, if valuing truth itself is motivated by this idea that truthfulness is good, that truthfulness is a moral principle, if truthfulness undermines morality, what you have is truthfulness then undermines truthfulness itself. Keep in mind, truthfulness is a moral value. Truthfulness undermines, in the eyes of these particular people, the idea of morality at all. If truthfulness undermines morality, but truthfulness is underpinned by morality, then you have the stimulant for nihilism here. And we can also talk about truth undermining itself via trust. So, we're often hearing these sort of words. We live in a post-truth world. People pick and choose what facts they want to believe. Oh, that's false news because I think it's false news. And so we can understand trust being something that can undermine truth in a particular way. And I'll show you how. So here's a graph showing the percent of people who trust the government in Washington always or most of the time. Now, the data started being collected in the 1960s. And you can see here, back then, trust was quite high. You had 80% of people trusted the government in Washington always or most of the time. Now, I don't know what Johnson did, but whatever happened at that point, at the end of the 60s, you see this huge decline from the 80%, all the way down to just the early 80s. You get to as low as nearly 20%. I'd say that's probably about 25, 30, or between that amount. And so trust in authority plummets. Absolutely plummets. And you see there's a little bit of an increase and then a drop and an increase and a drop, but eventually you get to the point where you've got Trump refers to himself as winning quite a lot, but you see here not many people seem to be trusting the government. He may even been a consequence of that lack of trust in government as well. But overall, you could argue here that truth was what undermined trust. People in the early 60s were, maybe you could argue, very naive about the state of their government, about the motivation of their politicians. Maybe they lived in this ignorance that painted this ideal picture of, say, American idealism, or American, what's the word I'm looking for? Is it basically this idea that America is amazing and that the government is pure and holy and uncorrupted. But then information starts to come out, and this really undermines the trust. And just in the same way as when Schopenhauer was talking about the naive ignorance of the child, and they are filled with hope, and so much so they're invigorated with an optimism. But then reality hits. Truth is shown to them, and this transforms their optimism into pessimism. And in the same way, we can say this transforms the trust of the people in those that are in power. That trust is transformed into a distrust, into a lack of confidence in those who are in power. And so here you have this weird thing, because we're now referring to it as post-truth. So it's not only affecting our relying or our ability to trust those in power, but also to trust the idea of the expert. So everyone is an expert now, and you have all these different newspaper organizations that have all their different political leanings, be that left or right, all bringing on their own experts, and all of these experts seem to be saying very different things sometimes. And for someone who can't really establish, like, well, what are the numbers of experts here, or maybe they're not, we're talking about the lay person here who's maybe engrossed in earning a living, in family life, in their own problems in life. We already mentioned life can be hard and categorized by this concept of suffering. So it's not incomprehensible to think that maybe the average person doesn't have time to look into all of this too much. And the being exposed to all of these different experts saying completely different things, which might be really confusing for them. And it leads to this idea of just picking and choosing a truth that you sort of feel, I don't know, it's that which you incline towards, not necessarily because it is true, but just because you have these intuitions or these feelings. Because what else have you got to go off if you don't really have the time for, deep and vigorous research? You're working 12-hour days, you've got bills to pay, you're in debt, you've got drug or alcohol problems, X, Y, Z, so on and so forth. You've not really, if you did have an education, you didn't really do too well at it, or you didn't really take much from that. So all of these factors, you may understand why a large portion of the population might not really have what it takes to find the truth explicitly, and so all they end up having to really go off is our intuitions. And for anyone that's sort of growing up and looking at this and seeing this kind of thing develop, it again might make them lose confidence that truth is something that can be achieved at all. And funnily enough, again, it is truth that gives rise to this feeling. So that they're looking at the world and they're finding truth here. That's a truth. This is a truth. That's a fact. This is a fact. All of these problems coincide, which undermine a person's or a group of people's confidence in their ability to actually achieve truth. How can I know anything? All of this time we thought this group of people were great, and then all of this information comes out, and it turns out that they've done some very dodgy things. How do we then move forward? Can that not be the case for everything? All of these things that I have confidence in, all of a sudden something comes out, and it could be very overwhelming. There are ways of overcoming this, but people, one of the main ways of overcoming it is patience. Just sort of not being so eager to just jump off the cliff and deny the possibility of achieving truth at all. It is possible to achieve it. A lot of it just takes time, research, dedication, and an understanding of how to deal with the evidence that's being put forward. All of these things are a method of achieving truth. But we live in a world where impatience is predominant. Patience is not really nurtured, and you see that with the expression of social media. You've got the rise of things like TikTok, where people can slide and you have 1 minute to say what, and the attention of people is dwindling. And this is something like, for example, we as YouTubers have to deal with. The majority of people, literally the majority of people, will begin watching a video and they stop watching it within the first minute. If you do not catch their attention, like rapid, you've lost them. And then obviously you have a small percentage that stick through all the way through to the end. But it's difficult, and people just, if you don't get to the point now, if you don't just give me everything I think I need to know straight away, I'm going to move on. And this is a problem. It's expressive of a huge lack of impatience. And this itself is one of the things that contributes to problems with regards to post-truth. People just are impatient, and they're not really willing to put in the effort to sort of discover things. So going back to this idea of higher values undermining themselves. So you have A, you have the particular value affecting something, B, which happens to be something that A ends up relying on, or something that has a knock-on effect which undermines A. So we had the example of truth undermining trust, which leads to skepticism, which is basically the idea that truth is difficult to attain, and the trust is lost because a society becomes corrupt. The people that were supposed to be left in charge. Obviously, these kind of problems, if a society isn't corrupt, which isn't inconceivable, maybe you have you can nurture a group of people within a community that when they get into power, they are trustworthy. That they, in the whole, really do fight against corruption and do well at that. This is conceivable, and insofar as that happens, and they, and the truth of this, and they're transparent, and the people can see there's nothing that they can hide. They're constantly in the public eye. This kind of thing might keep truth stable, or the idea of the general public feeling that they can achieve truth. That might not be undermined on that. But the second you get corruption becoming predominant and truth revealing that corruption, you have this undermining of trust, which undermines the idea that we can attain truth. And then the other example we gave, so you have truth undermining morality, which undermines truth because truth was considered a moral value. And it's a general principle. You have a higher value, undermines something which undermines the higher value itself. And so a society that has undermined its higher values, Nietzsche refers to this society as being left floating in an abyss. And there's a very poetic aphorism he writes in a book called The Gay Science. He talks about the madman running down from the mountains, and he's trying to find God, and he's calling to the people, "Where is God? Where is God?" And they're laughing at him, and they mock him. But he's not joking. He's deadly serious. He's looking for God, and he sees that the people have lost faith in him, and and not only have they lost faith, but they have trivialized it and made it into sort of child's play. And so he breaks the lantern and he scares them all. And then with his eyes, he pierces them and he screams at them and says, "You don't realize what you've done." This basically, in short, without going through it all, they have gotten rid of something, and they haven't noticed that the thing that they have gotten rid of is what facilitated the growth of what they live in. The only reason their society was able to develop the way it did was because of these particular principles, because of these particular beliefs. And insofar as they have gotten rid of it, they're basically knocking out the foundations from under themselves, and inevitably this will lead to a crumbling of all that which was built upon it. And they haven't seen that yet. They don't know that yet. Morality hasn't become a problem for them yet. All of these things are issues that Nietzsche is constantly alluding to. And then he describes it as a floating in an abyss. How did we unchain this planet from the star or from the sun? And is there an up? Is there a down? Is there a left? Is there a right? They're left without direction. They're left without any. They're left in the void. They're left in nihilism. And it's a really famous quote. Just kind of bring it up a bit because I'm hyper aware that this is a very depressing subject. So we've got a meme because everybody likes memes. And it's a quote from Nietzsche. "And if you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you." And there is a deep truth to that. Especially studying nihilism can often make people feel quite nihilistic in the end as well. So it's a subject matter you need to explore with caution. And again, you need to really understand the importance of patience here, and of due diligence, and not being lazy. And even when you're feeling a bit down, you need to do things that pick you back up again, and not to let it draw you or take too much energy away from you. Patience, because there is light at the end of the tunnel. So next we're going to talk about part 2, which is going to deal with threats to meaning. Now, I mentioned the author that we're going to be looking at here is Philip H. Phoenix, who wrote the book Realms of Meaning. This book, again, just to recap, was specifically focused on a philosophy of education. So he's exploring meaning and how that should be considered in terms of setting up a proper education, and how this is very important with facilitating human beings, putting them through an education system. This is a point he makes that is something fundamental to that, and you need to really have a grasp of meaning and its importance with the human being, and also with that, inevitably, you're going to need to understand threats to meaning if you're going to be able to facilitate meaning in a education system. And so, obviously, this is of interest to me, and ends up being extremely relevant with regards to our ideas of what causes nihilism. If we can identify threats to meaning, we can identify what leads us or what leads people into an abyss of meaninglessness. So I've got a quote here from page 5. He says, "Unfortunately, the pathway to the fulfillment of meaning is never smooth. The human situation is such that mankind is always threatened by forces that destroy meaning. Values, purposes, and understanding are fragile achievements and give way all too readily to attitudes of futility, frustration, and doubt. Meaning is thus lost in an abyss of meaninglessness. Now, keep in mind here, so he says here, they are fragile achievements and give way all too readily to attitudes of futility, frustration, and doubt. This again is characteristic of the lack of patience, and there's a reason why patience is referred to as a virtue, because the lack of it is dangerous. It gives rise to people becoming easily frustrated, seeing things as futile. It's giving up really quickly. It's very common that really young people, they're 17, 18, 19, they're at the doorstep of life. They've not even took a step into the big world yet. They're very much at the beginning of their journey. Inshallah, they live a long life, and so it will be the beginning of a longer journey. And may Allah grant you all long lives. But they feel lost. They feel like I need all the answers now, and they have huge books worth of questions they need answers to, and they'll just fire them out at everyone they can do, and then expect answers straight away. And it's unfortunately, it just doesn't work like that. And not only that, before they've even managed to answer a question, it's very, very common. You'd be surprised how common it is. Many times people might even send you these messages, and you get the impression that they think that they're the only one dealing with this, but it's a very, very common problem with many people. Something I suffered from when I was younger, and something I know many people who do. And it's characteristic of this lack of patience, of this dilettantism, of being interested in everything, the effort to comprendere, the need to understand everything. That is, to become a jack of all trades, to spread yourself so thin, you become a master of nothing, and you become overwhelmed. And all of these, we're going to touch on each of these and how all of them become a threat to meaning. But you see that this is the general theme of pessimism as well. When you've gotten yourself into attitudes of futility, of frustration, and of doubt, and meaning is thus lost in an abyss of meaninglessness. You see the expression of this common theme. You saw it in the works of Nietzsche. You saw it in the works of Schopenhauer. You're going to see it now again in the work of Mr. Phoenix, and how this itself, this pessimism, is something which is itself a threat to meaning, and you need to understand this in order to be able to sort of deal with it or overcome it. The perennial threat to meaning is intensified under the conditions of modern industrial civilization. So over this next part, we're going to be explaining how modern society really does facilitate this. Now, why is that of interest? Well, first of all, if all the world seems to be wanting to replicate this model, replicate the Western world, what you're going to see is the development of the problems that are present here as a result of the modern industrial civilization becoming an issue in everywhere that begins to adopt it. And so this isn't simply a European problem. It isn't simply a US problem or a Western problem. Western's obviously a very vague word, but this is a global issue. And it's a global issue because this modern industrial civilization is something that is being readily adopted all over the planet. There are a few exceptions to the case, North Korea, so on and so forth, where there is fighting and pushback. But there's the forces at play here that are facilitating these developments are extremely strong, and it's like trying to hold back a tsunami with a couple of twigs or sandbags. It becomes sort of a hopeless mission. So it's coming, it's on its way. We have to deal with it. We've got to know how to overcome it. And in order to know how to overcome it, we need to understand it. This is something even many of the ulama, so Al-Ghazali, he writes about this. When something becomes common, predominant, you can't ignore it. You have to go into it. You have to understand it, so you know how to overcome it, so you know how to deal with it to the best of your ability. And insofar as you neglect that, if you ever are forced by circumstances to have to talk on the matter, those who understand the problem are going to know you have no idea what you're talking about. They're going to know that you've got nothing to contribute here. And so how are you going to fix it? How are you going to offer any sort of remedy if you neglect the problems completely. And this ties in again to the first lecture where we were talking about why understanding this is important, why the subject of nihilism, although it is a horrible one, and again, studying it itself, with the quote, you look long into an abyss, the abyss eventually looks back into you. There is an effect, it has an effect on you, which is unfortunate. And ideally it'd be nice if we could all not have to deal with this subject at all, but unfortunately reality hits, and the necessity of having to fight something arises. The Mongols came to the doorsteps of those that they were invading. Ideally it'd have been nice if they didn't have to deal with them. Ideally it'd have been nice not having to try to understand them, try to figure out their tactics or how they work. But you've really got to observe your enemy, and in order to understand them, in order to be able to defeat the issues at hand here. So insofar as we're seeing nihilism as a poison or nihilism as a sickness, we have to study it. We have to, and that's not to say everyone has to, but there needs to be a sort of a push by a portion of the ummah to figure out how to deal with this. What are the problems at play here? How do we overcome them? And so here it goes into a few of them. So we've got 4 contributing factors in particular that deserve special emphasis. The first one is the spirit of criticism and skepticism. So this is going to be part A, and this spirit is part of the scientific heritage. We can also say that the philosophical heritage, but it has also tended to bring the validity of all meaning into question. The second factor is the pervasive depersonalization and fragmentation of life caused by the extreme specialization of a complex interdependent society. The third factor is the sheer mass of cultural products, especially knowledge, which modern man is required to assimilate. And the fourth factor is the rapid rate of change in the conditions of life, resulting in a pervasive feeling of impermanence and insecurity. So these 4 things are of great importance when we're considering threats to meaning, and this is what we're going to focus on now for the last part of the lecture. If you bear with me one moment, let's have a look. Okay, so first of all, the spirit of criticism and skepticism. So let's begin here. So Philip says the following on this particular quote-unquote spirit. He says, one of the prime enemies of meaning, the critical spirit, paradoxically also affords a major opportunity for growth in meaning. So we don't want to understand this particular section as a complete, should we say, bastardization of the idea of the spirit of criticism or being skeptical. It is, it definitely has its place and it definitely has its function, but it can be taken to an extreme, or it can be taken too far to the point where it becomes detrimental, not just to the ideas of things like religion, but even of modern society itself. That it can cause problems for any group of people that abide by any particular kind of ideology, and even those who sort of take this weird paradoxical route of trying to be without ideology, it can even undermine that, and it can undermine itself as well. And so we're going to go through that in a moment. But yeah, so it can be something that offers an opportunity for a growth in meaning, but it can also be critical to it. So doubt and criticism call old meaning into question. They destroy traditional assumptions and reveal the insufficiency of simple answers to profound problems. Such destruction of the old can open the way for new and deeper meanings, but on the other hand, criticism may become an end in itself without any positive effort at reconstruction. So we can talk about positive and negative, not necessarily in terms of happy and sad, although you can talk about it in that sense, but we're talking positive in the sense of offering something of positive value. So if you take a step in a positive direction, you're building something. You know, if you're making a house, in terms of making an argument or making a system of sorts, this is referred to as positive contribution. Negative contributions are destructive. So, you know, if you have a negative argument, you're arguing against something. You're showing that a particular position isn't reasoned as well as it could be, or that it's reasoned terribly, or that it shouldn't have been reasoned at all. And it's basically a moving forward. So people might build something in a positive direction, and building something in a positive direction doesn't mean that the thing that you're building is happy. You know, it doesn't mean it's positive itself. So Schopenhauer, for example, he put forward positive arguments in favor of his particular understanding of the world and of his place in it, even though all of that was extremely miserable in many ways. It was very pessimistic, you know, but we're still referring to this as a positive. So just keep that in mind when you're hearing these particular words. So on the other hand, criticism may become an end in itself without any positive effort at reconstruction. So it's just running around breaking things with a hammer, and then not building anything in its place, leaving a void, leaving an absence or a vacuum. So in that event, the critical spirit simply negates meaning. This nihilistic attitude is, in fact, a perversion and corruption of the experimental outlook, which has been one of the main springs of modern scientific progress. So when we say here, so this nihilistic attitude, as in the event the critical spirit simply negates meaning, you find this with a lot of people in the apologetics scene, where they're just sort of running around. It's very common with the atheistic scene, and you even find this even within Christian apologetics and within Muslim apologetics, where the apologist never offers arguments in favor of the thing that they advocate. You know, they never offer reasons to become a Muslim, or reasons to become a Christian, or reasons to become, you know, like what, you know, they never offer anything to replace the things that they destroy. So they, you know, their being is simply negative in that sense, in that they only want to undermine or negate the meaning of anything that this particular people hold, and then they don't offer anything to replace that, and they go away. And so when people lose their faith, or even when an atheist, like the positions that they held, if an apologist is dealing with this and only takes things away from them, only makes them doubt what they had, and never gives them anything to replace that with, what in effect they're doing is leaving them as a nihilist. They leave them in a vacuum. They destroy things and offer no reconstruction effort, and that's problematic, because the feelings of nihilism are mixed with feelings of pessimism, with anxiety, with fear, with all of these sort of things, and so it can express itself quite terribly. And obviously there's a spectrum of ways, be that severe depression, locking themselves inside, refusing to engage with the world, as far as suicide. It can also express itself quite destructively in heavily hedonistic YOLO sort of mentalities. So that would be sort of self-destructive, do what I want when I want, who cares attitude kind of guy or girl. And then you've got the outwardly destructive, where, you know, that you get people, and these are obviously the more extreme versions, and a lot rarer than the more common types. But the people who go out and they actively begin to destroy others. So you've got the school shooters and things like that eventually kill themselves in the end as well. Or, you know, these would be expressive of a sort of an extremely nihilistic outlook, where destruction becomes one of the only ways out. But again, it's rare. It's not as common as, say, the suffering from severe depression, and just becoming more hedonistic, or falling into some sort of escapism to not have to deal with the problems of your nihilism. That is sort of just binging computer games, or binging a particular lifestyle, working for the weekend, drug or alcohol problems. All these kind of things are means of escapism from problems of facing a nihilistic attitude. And so, you know, the path of skepticism which is obviously an innate part of the spirit of criticism, it can be walked without end. You can do this indefinitely. Everything that you put forward, you can be skeptical about, to the point where you can even be skeptical of whether or not the universe existed prior to 1 minute ago, or whether or not everything was brought into existence 1 minute ago, and everything that you consider a memory, so anything you think happened before then didn't really happen, that it was given to you, all memories were given to you 1 minute ago. And so you've been made 1 minute ago to believe that you've had this life, that there's this history. All evidence of any sort of historical progress, all evidence of anything that happened in the past was all created as well 1 minute ago. The severe skepticism would acknowledge that is possible, but it would also acknowledge that it could have been 2 minutes ago or 3 minutes ago. And obviously you can go on this indefinitely. And so there is this possibility, an infinite possibility, which is underpinned by the fact that we're finite, we're ignorant of many things, and it's hard to conclude with certainty many things. And so this is what we mean when we say the path of skepticism can be walked without end. You can just keep being skeptical of whatever proposition is being put forward. Now, Britannica, the website, on this, on skepticism, criticism, and evaluation, they have a really good quote that really gets this across. So they say, the criteria employed can be questioned and requires justification. How does one know whether one has the right criteria? By other criteria? Then are these correct? On what standards? The attempt to justify criteria must lead to an infinite regress or stop arbitrarily. If an attempt is made to justify knowledge claims by starting with first principles, what are these based upon? Can it be established that these principles cannot possibly be false? If so, the proof itself such that it can. If so, is the proof itself such that it cannot be questioned? If it is claimed that the principles are self-evident, can one be sure of this and sure that one is not mistaken? And can one be sure that one can recognize and apply the principles correctly? And it's just this idea. You can constantly question. The questioning never end. You just end up in this infinite regress. The problem is we don't live forever on this earth. We're all eventually going to die, and so the questioning ends upon our death. And there's another issue with it. It's self-refuting. The skepticism, or being infinitely skeptical or absolutely skeptical, requires you to also be skeptical of your own skepticism. Is it really necessary to be absolutely skeptical? Or should we be skeptical of this proposition and understand that there may be things that we don't really need to be skeptical about, and that there may be things that are reasonable to believe, that there are good reasons to believe. That is, not everything needs to be deductively explained and proved absolutely. But if we can show with evidences that there is good reason to accept something to be more likely the case than not, would it be reasonable in that case to stop being skeptical at that point? And even those who, for example, who push this. So, for example, it's a major factor in the scientific movement. The spirit of criticism and skepticism is a major part of that. But you'll find, obviously, that once you sort of move into the realms of conspiracy, which is an extreme version of this spirit of criticism and skepticism, you get people believing, for example, the earth is flat, or you get people believing that aliens are running the government, or whatever it is that they're believing. Some people have some even wackier ideas than any of them, unique ideas where they've got their own version of how things are. That is a result of the spirit of criticism, and it's not one that the scientific community finds very useful or finds very helpful, or if anything, they would invest a lot of time critiquing these ideas and being critical of them and skeptical of them, and saying that these positions are unreasonable. That in this case they've taken their criticism of the accepted paradigms, of the accepted models, and that their skepticism has gone too far. They're being too skeptical, skeptical beyond reason. So despite any of these criticisms of the spirit of criticism, or this absolute skepticism or criticism, some might still feel it's justified. They might just keep asking questions and then only stop when there ceases to be any answers. Obviously, if there are no answers, there's nothing to be skeptical about yet. And so they'll just end there and say, well, there are no more propositions. But again, this is just a destructive way of being. It is to remove any positive contribution. Positive, again, not in the sense of it being happy or blah, 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 but in the sense of it being something being added, something being created, something to adopt in some way. If you've just been skeptical to the point where there is no more things being put forward, there are no more questions, you left yourself in a void again, and then you're going to seek some sort of escapism, or you're going to move upon something or somewhere else, and at that point, obviously, you can stop being skeptical. However, the average person could never, I would argue, fully commit to absolute skepticism. It just would not be productive in any way. For example, if you were absolutely skeptical, and even people who refer to themselves as absolute skeptics, you wouldn't even be able to eat because, how do I know that this hasn't been poisoned? How do I know, that this isn't filled with some sort of deadly bacteria? How do I know that this, do I take the leap of faith and ignore the possibility that these may very well be the case? Because it is possible. Someone may have poisoned. He may have upset someone that really doesn't like him now and wants to see him dead or her dead. All of these are within the realm of possibility. And to neglect them as a possibility is to do that, to neglect the possibility, or to take a leap of faith that despite that it's possible, I need to eat, and this is going to be the only way that I do that. It's not practical in any way. And that's obviously an extreme example, but there are lots of that. Like if I go out today, am I going to get run over by a car? If I go to sleep now, is someone going to break in the house? If I go out, is someone going to break in the house? Even if I lock all the windows, do I need to get secure? Like you can just constantly be skeptical to the point where it just becomes impractical, and it's going to be an impediment to life. And so leaps of faith become necessary, and absolute the absolute spirit of criticism or skepticism becomes something that you can't really embody. You've got to leave it behind at some point in some way, so you can keep on living. Otherwise, the only other options are to just opt out completely. But in any case, everyone makes leaps of faith in many directions, small and large, into many different religions or into the lack of religion completely. For example, atheists themselves, and I write about this in my dissertation. So yeah, if you want to read about that, it's specifically part 2 in my dissertation. The link for that should have been on the welcome page for this particular lecture. But you'll see it a lot there, and I make the argument that even the atheist makes a leap of faith, and it's a consequence again of us being finite, of us having limited knowledge. We've always got to make leaps. We've always got to go forward in some way, or commit ourselves to something, whether or not we know it's absolutely true, or whether or not we know that there aren't other possibilities. You've just got to commit to that from time to time. So committed skeptic. So to conclude on this briefly. Committed skeptics offers a threat to meaning, and when you take it too far, you can only negate meaning with this. It's not to say everyone who is a fan of the spirit of criticism. Like I say, like even we would recommend a level of it, and we understand as Muslims the need for a certain level of criticism and skepticism. Don't believe everything that everyone tells you about the religion, for example. If you weren't somewhat skeptical, if you didn't check sources, if you didn't look into the chains of narrations and things like that, into the tafsir of a particular verse, or into the context of what was occurring around the revelation of this particular verse, if you just hear someone say something and just accept it, this can lead to some very problematic outcomes. And so we understand the need and the importance of it, and when it can be useful. And we are nuanced enough to say that it's that there are times and there are moments where it becomes problematic, and where too much commitment to it can only negate meaning and become hugely detrimental, or an issue individually and collectively. So anything positive offered to replace what has been negated, if you're sort of committed to this absolute skepticism, must have skepticism applied to it also. And this whole problem also ties into the next threats to meaning also that we're going to go over. So the second one is industrialization and alienation. And so on this, Mr. Phoenix says the following. So he says, another cause of meaninglessness in the contemporary world is the growing mechanization and depersonalization of life. So, it's treating society like one big machine, hence mechanization. And in this, you have the rise of technology, and all of this sort of, it's not so much, in terms of the machine as a whole, in its totality, as it moves forward, as it's churning out things and producing profits for a select group of people, and so on and so forth, who are competing with each other. It's not so much concerned with the parts of that machine. They become a part of it. They just sort of, I don't know if any of you have worked in call centers, for example. So I worked for a particular company, and when people were calling up, I was a representative of that company. Whoever I was, sort of, it didn't really matter. You could maybe mention it, but it was only insofar as it was beneficial for the company, insofar as it would sort of soften the customer up as they called up to deal with whatever problem they had. But you become the company you're working for almost. You are a representative of them, and that's the whole point of you being paid by them. You're supposed to represent them, and you're not supposed to waste time going too much into your own life. All these customers don't really need to know much about you. Keep it brief, keep it vague, keep it minimal, enough to keep them happy, and then move on. And so you lose your. It becomes very depersonal, and so this process of depersonalization, when you become a part of this machine, occurs, and obviously it becomes a threat to meaning. So he says here, man has become assimilated to the machine, and in the process has lost his identity as a person, which is pretty much reiterating what I've said there in a short way. So he has merged with the mass in the anonymity of impersonal organization. He's valued not for himself, but only for his contribution to the efficiency of the social mechanism. Hannah Arendt, in The Human Condition, has brilliantly analyzed this depersonalization as an inversion of the classical human ideal, according to which the contemplative, deliberative, and constructive powers were regarded as superior to the biological functions. So I'll just repeat that last bit. So there's an inversion of the classical human ideal, according to which the contemplative, deliberative, and constructive powers were regarded as superior to the biological functions. Modern man, by contrast, has largely lost interest in contemplation and enlists his political and creative activities in the service of material necessities. And so you see this with many laymen, with the average public, with you look at Western society, you look at what makes it tick. What are the industries that are booming for the most part? They are the computer game industries. So people just, they escape the troubles of this world into a fictional world like Skyrim or whatever other game they're playing, and they embody, a character. They LARP, live action role playing. What else? You've got an increase in how successful are gambling companies. So you've got casinos, and you've got the bookies, as we refer to them in the UK, which are just small bet shops. So, they're absolutely booming. People are using them like to no end. What are the other ones? The alcohol industry, the entertainment industry. The people, especially in the West, spend a lot of money and a lot of time on aesthetics, making themselves look good, and on going out and having a good time, on forgetting the troubles of life and working for the weekend. All of these things are not characteristic of a contemplative society. Obviously, you've got a portion of them who engage in the sciences or in philosophy or in certain elements of society where being a bit more contemplative is required. But it's not, it's not as common for many people. They engage in escapism, so they don't have to contemplate, so they don't have to face the issues in the world. And so further on this, it says, as a consequence, the person has been degraded into an animal laborans, that is, a laboring animal, chained to an endless cycle of production and consumption, lacking any of the authentic human meaning that belong to the thinker, the artist, and the free and responsible citizen of a genuine community. Now, keep in note as well, this seems to be, to some degree, in conflict with the previous one that we mentioned. So we were talking about the spirit of criticism and of skepticism. Now, keep in mind, when we're talking about the thinker, the artist, we're not talking simply in the sense of the negation or, the demolition expert, someone who just goes out and destroys things. The thinker, the artist especially, produces things of value, makes things and puts them into the world and gives them to others. So they add value. They don't just destroy what others valued. And so the spirit of criticism and skepticism, we did mention that it can be used in a beneficial way. So the thinker is going to utilize this, but it shouldn't be only in a negative sense. It should also be in a positive sense, in that you contribute something. But again, we're talking about how these are a threat to meaning, and how this common thing I'm going to keep referring to, the lack of patience, can also be a huge motivating factor to the extremes of these being manifested. And obviously, if, as I've argued as well, we have a society which is facilitating impatience with the things that it's producing for its populace, then these problems are only going to increase. If you have an increase in impatience in the society, if a lot of these extreme problems are the consequence of impatience, you're going to see them increase. And so, when it comes to this idea of industrialization and alienation becoming a part of, just a cog in the machine, becoming the laboring animal, that is, becoming slaves to lower systems of value, to those in charge, you become a slave to the company. You rely on them for your wage, you rely on them for the capital that you can pull out of that system, so that you can put it back into it, so you can engage in your escapism, so you can avoid having to contemplate. However, if someone does come along, you maybe push it away. So those of you who are here listening to this still, let's have a look how many of you are here still. So about an hour and a half in. Oh, mashallah, there's nearly 30 of you. So those of you who are here are not likely to be the type that get put off by this kind of conversation so easily. But I'm sure you are the type that has come across people and you try to engage with them in some sort of conversation, and they found it a little bit morbid or a little bit too deep, or send their head west. You've made them think a little bit too hard, and maybe that's caused you to feel a bit awkward. It's something I've felt, especially when I was younger, where I would always, having been a revert, I come from a world where I was engaged in this type of behavior I'm telling you about. So I have an insight into it, and I'm with people engaging in escapism. But I was always interested in asking these weird questions, or talking about life and thinking a little deeper into certain problems, and that would be referred to as a downer. Oh, you're putting a downer on the night, man. Forget that. Why don't be so miserable. Let's not think about death. Let's just have a good time. Let's just enjoy ourselves. Let's just try to chase these women. Let's just get some more shots going. Let's do this. Let's do that. Let's just do something that's going to make us feel good, man. Yeah. That kind of attitude. It's not not very uncommon. In fact, I would say, it's probably the norm, and the contemplative state within the average person that's in the machine, the modern industrial machine. It doesn't really go through any of this, and maybe they'll only become skeptical if you try to pull them out of it, if you try to get them to reflect on the meaning of life a bit more, on their position, and to try to find a higher purpose, or try to consider the divine, to try to consider the transcendent. At that point, they might offer skepticism insofar as they can negate it, to destroy it, make it something they don't have to deal with, so they can continue engaging in whatever it is that they want to engage in, that particular escapism they deal with. So as a consequence, the person has been degraded to an animal abhorrence, chained to an endless cycle of production and consumption, lacking any of the authentic human meaning that belonged to the thinker, the artist, and the free and responsible citizen of a genuine community. So an aspect of this depersonalization is the widespread fragmentation of modern life. Advanced civilization depends upon a high degree of specialization. When productive efficiency is the chief goal of society, the valuable principle of specialization degenerates into mere division of labor, with each worker performing relatively simple operations without reference to the meaning of the whole. Individuals thus become personally isolated, even though they are ostensibly connected to the organizational structure. So it becomes hard to see the bigger picture, basically. They become a pixel incapable of seeing the picture. And not only that, even if they could see the bigger picture, it doesn't even concern them so much, outside of the fact that they are a cog in that machine, insofar as they are a means to an end, that end being profits and gains. So it's not even necessarily beneficial for them to be able to see how they fit into that whole. When productive efficiency is the chief goal of society, the valuable principle of specialization degenerates into mere division of labor, with each worker performing relatively simple operations without reference to the meaning of the whole. They're not considering this is some grand plan that they're a part of. When you work for a major telecommunications company, you're not like, yeah, I'm doing something great for the world. Or if you work for a huge supermarket chain, or if you work for any particular company, it's very rare you find yourself, obviously there's again exceptions to the case, but again these are rare, hence there being exceptions. But for the most part, when you're working for these huge organizations, even when they have these attempts to sort of make you feel like you're a part of something bigger, it always feels really fake or forced. So when you have these, like, the sportswear companies, there's always these controversial adverts that come out where they try to make it sound like they're sort of down for this activism and so on and so forth, and they'll push certain political agendas as if they care about it, but you never really get this authentic sense of care there. It always feels like they're just tapping into something they feel is popular and something which is really going to promote their brand and then make sales shoot through the roof. There's always this taint of profits associated with these really big companies, and you find it very hard to see them as authentic or genuine in terms of when they get involved in these sort of activist ploys. So a society fueled by an obsession with material, hedonism, individualism, freedom, etc. This is what you're seeing. And all of this is really just pushing this industrialization and this alienation. So, it's a nasty feedback loop. And with regards to the materialism, you see that with this obsession with just having things and needing like the latest car or the latest gadget, the latest phone, the latest this hedonism, this endless seeking of pleasure and the escaping of pain often being very important, suffering being an inevitable part of life, and also something that leads to greatness, leads to growth. That, as they say, nothing great was ever achieved without some hardship. If it's not, I think, was it Muhammad Ali who was talking about, if you want to find diamonds, you've got to get in the dirt. You've got to dig through some mud. You've got to sweat a little. You've got to like attack some rocks with a pickaxe. You've got to exert some effort, some energy in order to find something of value. Things that come easy are not necessarily valuable. And so hedonism itself sort of neglects this principle quite a lot. Individualism and freedom are contributing factors to this idea of alienation. Individualism, being unique, is just another way of saying to be alone in many ways. We are communal beings, we are social beings, and we like to relate. We like to have a commonality between people. And insofar as we push an extreme form of individualism, of everyone having to be completely unique, of being a trendsetter, you're setting a dangerous task for people, and especially when it gets to a point where individualism is pushed so much that any sort of communalism is seen as a negative thing. A gathering of people under a particular cause is seen as herd-like, and it's not necessarily so. It doesn't have to be seen in completely negative ways. For example, when the Nazis were doing whatever they were doing, for there to be a communal sense of meaning in fighting, Adolf Hitler, or in fighting Stalin and his gulag, or whatever it is that you were fighting against. There is a sort of putting aside your individualism for a moment for a greater cause, for picking up a communal goal with people. There is a lot of benefit in that. There is a lot that can be said about communalism, and obviously insofar as you embody this sort of communalism and you negate individualism, you offer yourself for your community, you offer yourself for the people around you, for your neighbors, for your family, for your loved ones, for your friends. There is a lot to be said about this sort of mentality, but that itself, it would also negate alienation. Whereas insofar as you're negating that and you're focusing on the sense of individualism and freedom, I get to do what I want. I don't know if any of you have seen Pinocchio. If you haven't, search Pinocchio Pleasure Island. Basically, in short, Pinocchio is a wooden boy, he's a puppet who gets life, and he wants to become a real boy. And so he makes effort to try to do that. And he's offered an opportunity to go to this place called Pleasure Island, and it's sold to him by a couple of crooks as the best place. You have ultimate freedom. You can do whatever you want. And in the story, basically, a bunch of kids are taken there. They're all tricked to go there, and they leave their homes, they run away from their families, and they go together to this place called Pleasure Island, where they get to do whatever they want. They get to drink alcohol. And these are kids as well, by the way, keep that in mind. They're young children. They get to drink alcohol, they get to smoke, they get to smash windows, they get to do whatever they want, and there's no one there to tell them not to do it. There's no authority there, quote unquote, oppressing them or keeping them in check. They do whatever they want. And in the film, they become donkeys. That is, they make asses of themselves. And as the result of trying to chase this extreme freedom, they become slaves to the things that they thought they were free to do. And you see this today. Like, you see the people going on about, we should be free to be able to drink if we want to. And it's like, all right, go on. And then all of a sudden they become a slave to the drink. They become alcoholics. We should be free to make our own mistakes. They take drugs. They become slave to the drugs. We should be free to sleep with whoever we want. They become slave to the opposite gender, or they become slave to seeking sexual experimentation. They become addicts to this, that, the other. And the only reason they became slave to these things was because freedom was valued to an absurd extent, to the point of detriment, to the point where Allah, He says in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, with regards to alcohol, for example, it's not like there isn't good in it. There's not like there isn't some benefit for the people in these things. And you can look at the benefit. You can see how it does. In some cases, it helps socializing. People like my family, my Polish family, whenever there's a family gathering, there's always this huge awkwardness at the beginning. People are, a bit timid. They don't really know what to say to each other. Things are a little weird. And then at some point, someone starts going, "Hey, let's get the bevies." And then everyone starts drinking, and then everyone winds down, and they start to be able to communicate. And they all start laughing, and they enjoy themselves. And so you can consider that a benefit to a degree, where there's some sort of bonding happening. But as Allah says in the Quran, ultimately its negatives outweigh its benefits. And you see that, like, you have these happy family gatherings, and this happiness and this joy is sort of fueled by the alcohol. But as high as it can go, it can drop just as easily. And you see these problems constantly crop up again and again and again. And that is detrimental to family bonds. That is detrimental to the bonds of a community, insofar as you really, really like or love someone. As the saying goes, the people you love the most can also be the people you end up hating the most. And the reason you hate them the most is because it's a consequence of having loved them. And in the same way, at the beginning of this lecture, we were talking about how optimism can be itself the fuel for the pessimism, insofar as you hold it in a unrealistic sense, without any sort of association to truth, to reality. That optimism can be transformed when truth is revealed to you, into its polar opposite, into the opposite extreme. In the same way, if you're building friendships and connections based on this drunk, naive stupor, you're building it on something that's brittle, something that can easily be smashed. And as is all too common with people who get drunk and tipsy and silly and boisterous, that you're facilitating the conditions for the breaking of these brittle bonds very easily. And I've seen it happen all too often with people very close to me, as a result of this. And these are people that might even talk about how great these things are, and then guaranteed within a certain amount of time you always see that sort of deteriorate, or the benefits that they were talking about or bigging up not being permanent. And you see this again in the general society. So people don't really eat with their family so often anymore. And what's as a consequence of this? Is a consequence of people not really knowing their family. You've got both parents are working and not really getting time to spend with their children, so they don't really know their children. Children spend most of their time in the care of others, be that in school, after school club, out with their friends, or just doing other things, being in their room, playing on computers, talking to strangers on the internet. The families are becoming strangers to themselves, and they're becoming disconnected. So I did a poll recently, and even within Muslim communities, it's quite worrying. You see this increase of people don't sit at the table and eat a meal as often as they used to. People have TV trays. Maybe they all gather around the TV. They might still be together, but they're not paying attention to each other. They're not talking to each other. They're not really eating together. They're just eating next to each other, and their attention isn't on one another, but on the TV screen, which is wholly distinct from like a family meal around a table where there are no other distractions other than the food and the family. These are very distinct things. Or even more extreme cases, the families just sort of eat in their own rooms. Everyone gets a TV tray. They sit in their bedrooms and they do their own thing and eat their own dinner there. And this is a form of alienation from the family. And insofar as this is happening to the family, it is certainly happening within the communities. So let me just check. I might have. Yeah. So before I jump the gun there and start talking about the communities, focusing on this family. So children grow up more engrossed with their online social experiences than they do with their families. They're more engrossed with Snapchat and TikTok and all of this stuff, or even just the friends that they make while they're playing Call of Duty. They know more about them and what's going on with them, and they know more about each other than their parents know about their children. And the parents obviously are working all the time. They come home, they just want to chill. They've got to clean the house, they've got to clean the mess the kids are making, they've got to do all of this. And they just want some alone time. They just want a bit of time to not have to do something. And so they're quite happy just leaving the kids to get on with this stuff. Again, this is a growing problem. It's not to say that I'm not talking statistics here, so Allahu Alam, how many people, what are the numbers? Maybe it's 20%, maybe it's 30, 40, 50, 60, 80, Allahu Alam. The point is that it is a problem, and that it's growing, and you can see that this is growing. And I think it's, it's a fair argument to make that even if it's happening at 10%, 5%, that this is still a problem, and that you can see that it's increasing, and that as the computer game industry, for example, is becoming more complex and more engrossing, and more common. So games. When I was younger, would play games that were really, really simple, the Sega, the SNES, and you could only really play them for so long before you got bored of them. They weren't that engrossing, and then we would go out and we would play. But you're not seeing that as often anymore. You're seeing children engaging in these games, and playing on them for days. And even I, growing up, when games started becoming more complex and more engaging, would find that as well. So even after I got back from traveling, there was a period of time where I was just on Skyrim non-stop every day. And you see this with many young people. It's a huge problem in Japan. So there's a lot of studies going on with regards to the Japanese culture in general. It's having massive problems with this kind of thing. And there's an obsession with those who are not necessarily just kind of being stuck in the house, but with this mentality of YOLO or FOMO. YOLO being you only live once, I can be reckless and do what I want, and let me make my own mistakes kind of attitude. And FOMO being the fear of missing out, and being anxious. I need to go here. I need to be with these people. What if something great happens and I miss out on this? And this motivates people to do things, to not, maybe they don't want to spend time with their family because there's all these interesting, exciting things happening with this group of friends. All of this is sort of promoting this alienation from family, from community. It's creating brittle communities elsewhere, usually fueled by other means. And again, this isn't to say it's in an absolute sense. I'm not saying that everyone in the West is just getting drunk and everyone is basing their relationships on drug and alcohol fueled binges. That obviously is not the case. There are a decent portion of the population that can hold a close relationship with people. So it's not a widespread problem in the sense that every family is dealing with this. I'm sure there's functioning families. I'm quite positive and comfortable admitting that. But the portion, I would say, and it'd be really interesting to see more studies going into this. Obviously, the problem is it's quite hard. It's touching on quite personal levels, and to what degree people are going to be comfortable going into this is an interesting question in and of itself. But it's a common problem. People are strangers to their neighbours. They don't even really know who their neighbours are. Many people describe their neighbours as strangers and couldn't even tell you their names. And you have the increase of this sort of adaptation of plonkers. These are 3 examples. There's probably a few more I could have put on there. But you just have people looking up to particular characters, and celebrity culture in general is sort of alienating because it's a one-way relationship. Insofar as people are trying to connect to these people that really don't care about them in any way, that really don't have a genuine care. That they're making money, they're doing things that are benefiting them. They're getting a place in society, they're getting money, they're getting status, they're getting this and getting that, and people pushing this sort of alienates them from people that they could have spent time. The amount of energy sort of given to some of these celebrities, if that was just given to the community, if that was just given to your neighbors, if that was given to your the people around you, your family, your friends, the bonds that could be, the mutual bonds, two-way bonds that could be created there, there's no saying how strong those bonds could be if that energy was placed elsewhere. So the more technologically interconnected society becomes, the more isolated its citizens. The more effort you use to the internet, like what we're doing here, we're communicating with people all over the world. The more effort you put in this, the less effort you're putting in the people around you. And again, the strive to be different or unique begins to amplify our isolation. Being unique is just another way of saying to be alone in a certain way. And these can all be said to be the consequences of modern capitalist society in many ways. Now, with this sort of critique, people might jump onto this particular critique of me and say, "Oh, you're a communist, Harry." I would say that there is something to be said of, for example, Marx and his criticisms of capitalism, and we can take a lot from even his work on that. But his solutions to these problems were lacking in many ways. And so, don't take me as a Marxist. I'm certainly not a communist. I'm just also certainly not a hardcore capitalist either. I think we need to sort of not fall into this dichotomy. It'd be a false one. You don't have to be a Marxist, or necessarily, if you reject that, be the other, that is a capitalist. We can offer critiques of each, and Marx offers some pretty decent criticism of capitalism itself, even if what he offers as a solution to that is really, really bad. So here's another meme. Capitalism does not work because people are selfish. And then he has this really stupid idea that people will work for the common good in a socialist society. Nietzsche even has a really good critique of this mentality as well. He says the communists or the socialists, they confuse causes with effects. And so they look at greed in society and say, capitalist society caused the greed. And he says this is confused. It's the opposite way around. Greed caused capitalist society. There was greed way before capitalism was about. And even if you were to get rid of it, you would still see greed in a communist society as well. And so that was just a brief point on that for those who think that this was maybe leaning towards communism. And no, I'm not a communist. I'll try and run through these a little bit quicker because I'm conscious that we've been going for 2 hours now. So the next one, overwhelming overabundance. Let me just see how many people we still got with us. Mashallah, only a couple of you have dropped off. May Allah reward you, those who are putting up with this. So just as the another quote from Mr. Phoenix. He says, just as the critical spirit is both an opportunity and a threat to meaning, so may the wealth of possibilities of meaning in a complex culture become a source of meaninglessness. Modern man is presented with an enormous number and range of possible experiences. Our civilization is exceedingly complex and makes demands that no one can expect to satisfy fully. The limited skills required in earlier societies no longer suffice for life in a complicated industrial civilization. Knowledge proliferates at such a rate that even specialists cannot keep up or keep abreast of everything being learned in their own fields. Moreover, they can acquire no more than the most partial acquaintance with what takes place in any other field. So this is the idea of being given way too much information to the point where individuals certainly can't process all of that information. And even when you look in terms of globally or communally, the community can't process all of that information. The more questions we get answers to, the more answers we have, the more questions they give rise to. And so although we have this pool of knowledge increasing, and it's arguably, the largest it's been in terms of knowledge, in terms of what we can know about the natural world, in terms of what we can know about the human body, in terms of what we can know about a lot of things. We've invested a lot of time studying a lot of these things, collecting data, collecting information, and we have a lot of that. So we have a huge pile of knowledge, but we also have a growing pile of knowledge, which is negative knowledge. That is knowledge of what we don't know, knowledge of our ignorance. And the knowledge of our ignorance has increased exponentially quicker than the knowledge of the things we know. So you have positive knowledge, negative knowledge. Positive knowledge are things you can say about the world. I know that this pen is green. I know, my name is Yusuf. I know I live in north of England. I know, these positive knowledge. What I don't know, I'm aware there's a lot more that I don't know than I know. My ignorance outweighs my knowledge, and modern society is suffering from the same predicament. We have gone out into the world. We've gone out into the galaxy. We've gone out into, we've tried to escape the planet, and we've collected a lot of information, and that has grown. But then relative to our now perceived ignorance, that has grown so big that our knowledge in comparison, if you acknowledge it, obviously there are people that will just neglect our ignorance, neglect how this has increased exponentially, and they'll just focus on the pile of knowledge and then big us up as if we've become gods, or if we're on our way to becoming that. And, oh, you know, we know so much, we know this, we know that. And it's like, yeah, relative to what we used to know, this pile looks pretty big. But relative to what we now know we don't know, that dwarfs what we do know. And if you are aware of this pile of negative knowledge, that if you're aware of our ignorance, this pile of knowledge isn't as impressive as it is if you pretend that that doesn't exist. If you ignore our ignorance, and the scale of our ignorance, and if you only focus on what we have and what we used to know, if you look back at history and at the communities of people that came before us and look at them as idiots in comparison to what we have now, you can do that. But I would argue if you do that, if you look down upon history and what people used to know, you're completely neglecting how ignorant we know we are now. And this is, again, something that's a huge contributing factor to the threat for meaning. It's just there's so much information, there's so much to process, there's so much going on that the task of ever actually processing it, the task of ever getting to that end, of coming to a full understanding of what's going on in the natural world, what are the fundamental principles that give rise to existence, how does all of this work, how does all this relate to each other, the scientific process itself is again something that's undermining itself. It's something that is we set off in the early Enlightenment period. You're looking at the 1700s. There was this naivety, akin to what Schopenhauer was describing with this childlike mindset of this optimism. We're on the path of reason and enlightenment, and even the word enlightenment is indicative of this mentality, of this optimistic mentality. That so long as we abide by these particular principles, we will become gods. This sort of mentality. But then reality kicks in, and the chances of that seems to dwindle the further you go down this path. Rather than becoming these superhumans, we seem to be more becoming these robots. This idea of transhumanism, of literally replacing the human body, of even just trying to escape. The body itself becomes a burden to be overcome, and rather than something to be in awe of. And there's a huge problem, and there's so much information there that the whole thing really frustrates those that look at it as something to overcome. The task becomes an impossible one. So further, he says, in the face of this hyper-abundance of culture and the profusion of related problems, modern man feels frustrated and impotent. He is presented with more stimuli than he can possibly cope with, and more experiential material than he is able effectively to organize and assimilate. Becoming bewildered and distracted, he tries to escape from the unmanageable multiplicity by taking refuge in more highly specialized activities. And he abandons hope of finding, again here, abandons hope. So it's key, again, in line with this notion of pessimism, this idea of hopelessness. And he abandons hope, finding any coherence among the fragments of experience which he undergoes. So this is, again, this notion of the absurd. So in the first lecture, we touched on this, the experience of the absurd. You look at the world, we have these innate desires for reason and meaning. And then when we look out into the world, when we look at the dunya, when we look at the, what is external to us, that which we find ourselves in, we fail to find things that fill these holes in our hearts. We have these gaps, and there's this yearning that we have. But when we direct the desire to fulfill that yearning externally into the dunya, into the world, into the universe, we fail to find things that ever facilitate fulfilling that yearning, fulfilling that desire. And this is what gives rise to the feeling of the absurd. this is what is motivating these, this pessimism. This is what is motivating these, these feelings of nihilism. But we can offer a bit of skepticism here, ironically. Is it really the case that the dunya is the only place you can point at this desire? This yearning for meaning and reason. Is the dunya the only answer to that? And if it is the only answer to that, then of course you're going to have this experience of the absurd. But it's by no means evident or necessarily the case that that is the only place. The function of these desires, of this innate feeling, this yearning for meaning, for reason, that the fulfillment of that might be elsewhere. It might be in something transcendent. You can see where I'm leading to here. The yearning itself might itself be an evidence that points you away from the dunya, points you away from the universe, points you away from the world. And when you point that yearning and that desire at the world, and you find that it isn't satisfying that thirst, that itself is another evidence that maybe you're pointing it in the wrong direction. Some people, unfortunately, they don't come to that conclusion, and instead they look and they abandon hope. They become pessimistic. They see the world as this hopeless, frustrated. They become, modern man, feels frustrated and impotent. He's presented with more stimuli than he can possibly deal with, and he becomes overwhelmed by it. He shuts down, and he just becomes bewildered and distracted. He tries to escape from the unmanageable multiplicity by taking refuge in more highly specialized activities, gaming, computer games, being obsessed with your looks, being obsessed with YouTube personalities. All of this, all of these are forms of escapism, trying to deal with these, the thirst or the yearning, the desire, the wish to have these holes that we have in our hearts filled. Now, did I finish that quote? Fragments which he undergoes. In this way, the consequence of cultural affluence is to reinforce a trend towards meaningless, inherent in the depersonalization and fragmentation of life previously described. You can see how all of this interconnects. So we're moving from one category to the other, which obviously is to highlight the distinctions between them, but they relate heavily. Now, this is related to overchoice. Now, overchoice here. There's another book by someone called A. Toffler called Future Shock, and in this he makes mention of this idea of overchoice. Overchoice. So freedom, for example, we'll get into it. So they may turn out to be victims of that peculiarly super-industrial dilemma, overchoice. This gives rise to the point at which the advantages of diversity and individualization are cancelled by the complexity. He's referring to economic decision, but I'm going to make a connection to intellectual endeavors as well. So the complexity of the buyer's decision-making process. So what this is, modern capitalist society thinks that freedom is ultimately the best thing ever. And so the more choice someone has, the better that's going to be. If you go to a coffee shop, you've not just got, a cappuccino or a black coffee or a white coffee or this, that. You've not just got that. You've got like 50 billion ways you can have these coffees. And if you multiply these choices indefinitely, you end up having this problem called overchoice, that there is too much choice, and that is that the point to which the advantages of diversity and individualization, uniqueness, or the opportunity for uniqueness, the advantages that are brought out from that, they're cancelled out. They are completely destroyed and overtaken by the overwhelming process, which is the decision-making process. Having to decide becomes extremely difficult. And this is the case when it comes to buying things, as Toffler is pointing out here in Future Shock. That is the case with that. But it is also the case when it comes to ideology or intellectual endeavors, trying to figure out things, when you've got like 50 million choices at university, which one's the right choice to go down. And then not only that, the more involved you get in a particular subject, the more specialized you have to become. So say, I'm interested in science. To begin with, in college, you study all four categories of that. You'll study physics, chemistry, biology, mathematics. And then you go into university and you're like, I'm going to focus on one of them. And so maybe you're more interested in physics. So you go to study physics. Obviously, you had to study all four of them to figure that out. But now you become more specialized. You're honing in on a particular category of science. So you do your BA in that. And throughout your BA, as the years go through, so year 1, year 2, year 3, you become increasingly more specialized in a particular area of interest. Then you maybe finish that and you go in to do your masters. And then when you do your masters, it's not just doing a masters in physics. You're now becoming even more specialized in your masters. You pick a area of physics you want to focus on and hone in. Maybe you go to do a PhD. You become even more specialized. And in that previous quote as well, we were talking about the limited skills required. Yeah, so knowledge proliferates at such a rate that even specialists cannot keep abreast of everything being learned in their own fields. The fields themselves become so complex, so vast, that there's no hope of even being able to completely absorb everything that there is to know in that particular field, let alone the other fields. If you're studying physics and your focus and your research is totally on quantum physics, or in a particular theory in quantum physics, or in a particular problem, you have to give all your energy into that. But there's a problem with that, obviously, insofar as you're giving all your energy into that, you're neglecting many other things that are occurring in the field. And so you can maybe have like a general insight into them, and you can have conversations and maybe learn from what the other people in the field are doing. But you are wholly ignorant of a lot of things in these things by necessity. And the people who aren't are the ones studying it. But then there's a problem in the fact that they're only going to have limited insight into the things you're studying. And so you have issues of communication. Are we effectively organizing well enough so that we're all recognizing important problems, or are there a lot of things that we're overlooking because it requires a sort of a fusion of understanding two fields, completely, in order to combine and recognize a relation between the two. But the fields themselves, unfortunately, are so complex that no one has enough life or enough time in life to be able to gather as much information. A lot of these problems probably require that. And so you have to start offloading it onto machines and things like that. And then all of these extra problems start to come from this. And you see that this consequence is of this overabundance, of there being too much. And then looking at all of this, recognizing these problems, it gives this experience of overchoice. And there's an author called Barry Schwartz, and he's written a book on the paradox of choice. And he goes into a number of things. We're not going to go into too much detail here because it's already going on quite a bit. But we're going to talk very briefly. So he's, in part 3, he says why we suffer with regards to choice. And he has a number of chapters here, so chapters 5 to 10, and they briefly go over a number of these things. So the first one is choice and happiness. And he says, I quote, "The modern Americans have more choice than any group of people has ever had before, and thus presumably more freedom and autonomy. But we don't seem to be benefiting from that psychologically. What we mean by that is that you see huge rates of depression, huge rates of suicide. I alluded to these in the earlier part of the lectures, and there's this pursuit of happiness in the same way that, the more you want something, maybe the further away you push it. And this certainly seems to be something that we're dealing with. The modern world has just valued freedom to such a degree that it's tried to increase it, but in doing so, it has in many ways, it's had to, there's another argument here, which is a whole nother set of conversations we could have. But in the attempt to try to increase freedoms, we thought, or we assumed, that would necessarily lead to an increase in happiness. But that doesn't seem to be, there doesn't seem to be a necessary connection between the two. And there's a number of reasons for that. So the first one is missed opportunities. So he says here, part of the downside of abundant choice is that each new option adds to the list of trade-offs, and trade-offs have psychological consequences. The necessity of making trade-offs alters how we feel about the decisions we face, More important, it affects the level of satisfaction we experience from the decisions we make. So this is this idea of FOMO, or the fear of missing out. If you make a choice, maybe you've missed out on something better over there. You're constantly having to deal with, but what if, if only, so on and so forth. And then this leads to this idea that the problem of regret. Anytime you make a decision, it doesn't turn out well, or you find an alternative that would have turned out better, you're a candidate for regret. This post-decision regret, this is post-decision regret that occurs after we've experienced the results of a decision. So you may have really hyped up this particular choice. Where do I go on holiday? You pick a particular place, you go there, and it's like, it wasn't that great. It was hyped up. The adverts made it seem a million times better than it was. But only if I'd have gone there, maybe that would have been better. And then you've had so much choice that you can't help but feel maybe there was a better choice. What if only, so on and so forth. And this affects or causes a suffering, which again sort of leads to this pessimism. All of these ideas are connected. And obviously, insofar as you're becoming pessimistic as a result of overchoice or being overwhelmed by overabundance, then all these other issues, if pessimism is a prototype of nihilism, then obviously this is going to kind of lead to that. Why decisions disappoint? The problem of adaptation. So because of ubiquitous features of human psychology, very little in life turns out to be as good as we expect it will be. You're hit with a double whammy: regret about what you didn't choose and disappointment about what you did. This ubiquitous feature of human psychology is a process known as adaptation. Simply put, we get used to things and then we start to take them for granted. Aftershave is a good example of this. Someone gets you your favorite aftershave, and it's your favorite because you've always smelt it on other people. And insofar as it was something you could smell on other people, it was always something you could really enjoy. SubhanAllah, what a beautiful smell. I want that. Eventually someone gets it you, or you buy it for yourself. SubhanAllah, my favorite aftershave. Oh, yeah, and you put it on and it smells great. Yeah, it smells amazing. And then eventually it starts to wear off and you can't even smell it anymore. You adapt to the smell to the point where it just becomes peripheral and you can no longer smell it. And then, you've spent what, 50 quid, 100 quid on whatever this aftershave is. And now all you can smell is everyone else's aftershave. And now you've got a new favorite aftershave and you're ultimately disappointed. If you're on, this is the problem of adaptation. Things can become normal. What's the word? Depletion. I go on about it a lot. I would think I could have remembered it quicker than this. Diminishing returns. Problem of diminishing returns. Every time you return to something, its effect is less. Now, why everything suffers from comparison is another issue. So the circumstances of modern life seem to be conspiring to make experiences. Have I skipped a bit? The circumstances of modern life seem to be conspiring to make experiences less satisfying than they could have been, and perhaps should be. In part because of the richness against which we are comparing our own experiences. Again, as we'll see, an overload of choice contributes to this dissatisfaction. Now, we're all connected, or the majority of us, especially if you're watching this, we're connected to the internet. And so everything is going to suffer from comparison, because no matter where you go, you can always look and see what others have, or what others are doing. You might want to go into a particular field and you might have a huge passion to go into that. And then when you do, you're like, no, and you're looking over at someone maybe studying history, someone else maybe studying law or business or this or that. Only if, I could have done that. You can watch them, you have an insight into their life, you can watch these influencers on YouTube. But look at what they're doing. That seems so great. They seem to be having so much fun. Comparison here is the thief of joy, and is, contributing again to this dissatisfaction. And another point he goes into is, whose fault is it? This is Barry Schwartz, by the way, so it's all in his book, the problem of choice. He says, unlimited choice, I believe, can produce genuine suffering. When the results of decisions about trivial things or important ones, about items of consumption or about jobs and relationships are disappointing, we ask why. And when we ask why, the answers we come up with frequently have us blaming ourselves. What an idiot I am. Why did I make that choice? Why did I not just go for that other one? And, this regret, this guilt, this you can start feeling disappointment, depression, shame, and you point this at yourself, and you become resentful of yourself as a result of it. And again, this is contributing towards suffering, contributing towards the onset of a pessimistic outlook, which further contributes to the onset of things like nihilism. There is a lot of knowledge in the world. Where do you start to search? How do you begin this journey? Which path do I begin to walk upon? There's just too much to process. Paralysis ensues, and feelings of a loss of hope of achieving the truth or finding the answers you're looking for can ensue as a result of this. Again, consequences of lack of patience. You half of the time, maybe there is other ways of approaching it. We're going to look into this in the future lectures, and also in the part 2 of the essay in much more detail. We're going to touch on this, inshallah. And you don't have to lose hope. You can have patience. You can work through these problems, but people find it hard, and they find it hard because they're being overwhelmed. They're being bombarded with an indefinite amount of information, and they're finding it hard to process it. They're finding it hard to figure out independently, where do I go to overcome these issues? Where do I go to find truth? Where do I go to find answers? And the sheer size of the task reduces any meaning to nil. And the whole endeavor becomes a pointless one. If I'm going to die before I can even take 1% of a step in the right direction, what's the point on even moving in that direction at all? If I can't achieve totality, if I can't completely process the universe and everything in it, why bother even beginning that task? What's the point? Nihilism. What's the point? Hedonism. What's the point? Escapism. All of these different methods of having to turn away and to flee from the issues that modern society puts forward. And last of all, and this is, I promise, it's not going to take too long. Inshallah, should be able to run through this last section quite quickly, as it's pretty short. Last of all, you have rapid rates of change as a threat to meaning. And so, what do we mean by that? So, is the final quote, one of the final quotes. One further significant factor in adding to the meaninglessness confronting modern man is the rapid changes taking place in every sphere of life. Transformation in the content and conditions of experience make life unsettled and precarious. Nowadays, the world in which the average person dies is vastly different from the world in which he was born. Few traditions remain as unchallenged few traditions remain as unchallenged points of reference. Rarely are there settled orders around which a person can organize his hopes and expectations. Change is the only certainty, and transience pervades everything. These upheavals are a constant source of anxiety and insecurity. They diminish the value ascribed to anything that now exists, in view of the probability that it will soon be superseded by something else. The meanings that enrich human life are found in abiding patterns persisting through time and change. I'll repeat that. The meanings that enrich human life are found in abiding patterns persisting through time and change. So that bit really gives me an increased appreciation of the Quran. It is the constant and permanent that help to overcome the anxiety of meaninglessness. It is for this reason that the transience of modern life presents such a threat to meaning. What do we mean by that? So back in the day, you had granddad, dad, me, your son, and maybe your grandson, and so you have like 5 generations of people. Now, granddad comes from a time gone way back, and your grandchildren are going to grow up in a future world. Now, back in the day, the world that your granddad lived in wasn't really going to be that different from the world that your grandson was going to be born into and live in. Rates of change were very minimal. I'm talking like centuries ago here. But 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, even 1,000 years ago, things weren't really changing that different. And whatever the granddad was learning, he was learning, and whatever he was learning was going to be useful for his children and his children's children and his children's children's children. They were going to be able to pass that information on and utilize it, because the world that he lived in was going to be pretty much the same world that his children were going to live in. And so, the rates of change weren't that quick. And so what you were learning felt valuable. What you were learning, the traditions you were taking on, felt that they were going to be useful because you could give them to people. And not only that, you could come to understand them and give them to your children. They could come to understand them quicker because they're going to be able to overcome a lot of the teething problems that you had to go through. They won't necessarily have to make the same mistakes you made. They can adopt that and adapt to it and add to it, and get an increasing understanding of the world. And so you have this benefit and slow rates of change, and that as generations go by, they can inherit a wealth of knowledge that is relevant, because the knowledge was obtained in a world that is still pretty much, for the most part, present in these 5 generations. And so the granddad and the grandson, there's not much change in these generations. And so the granddad might have lived in the 1200s, the grandson off. So the grandson here, there's different. So the granddad is the granddad of Mr. Now. Mr. Now's granddad lived in 1200s. Mr. Now also has a grandson. So Mr. Now's had a child, and that child's had a child. So here, I could have probably done this a bit better. Granddad and grandson grandson isn't calling granddad on that picture granddad. Granddad is the grandson's great granddad. But there's a lot of time that separates them, and even so, there's not much change that has occurred, and so they live relatively the same. However, in the modern world, we don't have that no more. There is so much change, and so quickly, that even within one lifetime, things can be so different that the person in his old age can be living in a completely different world than the world that he was born in. The elderly, so people hitting 100 today, have seen the world change like no other people have ever seen a world change. There's been so much quote unquote progression, transformation, that it was impossible for any of them to be able to keep up. And you'll see this expression, any one of you that's watching this that's young, or even if you're elderly or older, you'll find a disconnect between the generations. The older generation, the 80s, people in their 80s, their 90s, have no idea what's going on with the youth of today. And they say it like bluntly, what's going on? I can't get these kids. I don't know what's going on. And the kids feel disconnected from the elderlies, because the elderlies grew up in a different world. Their elders, their uncles, what they became used to isn't even here anymore. What they learned to adapt to is long gone. The world that they lived in no longer exists. These are new ages, new problems, new issues, new things going on. And like even myself, so like I got here, so you got Mr. Now, age 10, he lived in one particular world. Age 20, he lived in a different kind of world. Age 30, you got even more transformation. And it just in one lifetime alone, there's enough change so that like you can sort of make distinct these different decades, not even centuries. And so what can granddad teach his grandson now about a world that he just really doesn't know? How much information can he pass on? I'm sure there is a lot of value that he could pass on, but because the worlds that they grew up in are so different, because the things that they value are so different, that it might feel like an impossible bridge to gap. The grandson, out of his ignorance, with his youth, his naivety, with the things that he's obsessed with, might not see that his grandfather has anything to offer him of value, and that can cause a sense of meaningless. What was the point of me attaining any of this knowledge if it's just going to die with me and I can't pass it on? It's of no use to the people, and the people that are growing in today's age are becoming hyper aware of that. And I guess this is again also contributing to the factors of impatience. What's the point in dedicating too much into a thing if it's just going to become obsolete? You even have like these ideas of planned obsolescence. So things are being built with their obsolescence in mind, with replaceability. This is also tied to problems with capitalism as well. There's a really good documentary called The Light Bulb Conspiracy, which goes into this. And it was basically a problem that it looks at. So at what point the light bulb was made, and the light bulb companies were fighting to make the longest lasting light bulbs, but it ended up being to their detriment. And what ended up happening is that They were making light bulbs last too long, so it wasn't profitable. People weren't needing to buy light bulbs because the light bulbs were lasting for ages. And so there was an agreement that they would limit the life expectancy of a light bulb. And it was the first time in history, and one of the first times in history, where there was research that you would maybe consider anti-progress, or like there was research on how to make a light bulb last for a specific amount of time and basically be less effective. That is, planned obsolescence was being born. And so this was the idea that things were being built with the hope that they would break so that the consumer would need to go and replace them. And this was considered good for the economy and good for business. Obviously, if your things are breaking, like you're going to have repeat customers. If you're making things to last, you're not going to have repeat customers, and the product becomes something that you sell once and then you don't have anyone return, which can be an issue. And if it's really, really good, people can inherit these things, and so the new generation won't even need to buy things because they don't need to replace them because they're still working. So you have this idea of making things break, and this transformed into what Apple have managed to create, which is planned obsolescence that is voluntary. So your product might not even be broken, but you want to replace it. The new iPhone has come out every year for however many years, and you've got a class of people that, even though the iPhone that they had is still pretty new in comparison, there's people that get rid of the, like, I don't even, what am I? I've got the 6S. I'm like 6-7 models, maybe even more behind in terms of the iPhone. And there's people that have bought the iPhone 11 and then a year later are willingly giving it up, getting rid of it because they want the newer version. This is planned obsolescence. This is obsolescence where you convince the customer to replace things that they don't need replacing. And so, and this again facilitates this rapid rates of change, these huge issues. Not only that, you've not only got this with technology, but you've got this issue with jobs. So you had the elevator man. It used to be a job where a man would stand in the elevator and he'd make the elevator go up and down. Technology increased to such a point where that became redundant. You have a look at the modern issues. So a huge industry is the transportation industry, or the delivering of goods from one place to another. And there's a lot of lorries. You look at the rise of Amazon. Everyone's doing, especially now with COVID and lockdown, everyone's doing their shopping online. There's a lot of delivery men. There's a lot of people, delivery drivers, taking things about. Now, as technology increases, and we can see this kind of in the process of happening, what's going to happen when technology takes that job away? We don't need delivery men anymore because we've got robots that drive these trucks, or drones that drop packages off outside your house. When it comes to sort of mastering certain things, if you're just going to be replaced by something, what are you going to do? And this ends up giving rise to this absolutely classic meme where these people have been dedicating themselves to particular jobs, and they've been really focusing on this for so long, but then technology just comes along and replaces them, and they've spent their whole lives mastering a particular field that has become redundant and a complete waste of time. And there was this trope that was being said, you'll just have to just learn how to code, because that's where all the job is, that's where the future is. But if someone's like 80 years old or 70, even 50, 60, it just feels like they've wasted all of that time. And that reduces the meaning of the purpose of doing all of that work to nil. People feel like, that was completely pointless. It's like, I don't know if you've ever played a game and you've invested loads of time on it, and then the save or the file save becomes corrupted, and so you lose all your progress. Or you've been working on a particular document and your computer crashes, or the document becomes corrupted, and all of this work that you'd lost, you had, was lost. It makes the effort feel pointless. It makes the whole exercise and the energy that you exerted feel completely wasted. And again, these rapid rates of change, you can barely keep up with them. They contribute to threats to meaning. So concluding statements, modern society motivates pessimism, and obviously all these other things, so a lack of patience, to the threats of meaning. Higher values can undermine themselves and do undermine themselves. Confusion caused by cosmopolitanism or multiculturalism mixed with secularism, that is an attempt to flatten all value systems and make them equally as important as each other, regardless of whether or not there are contradictory elements within them. Increasing distrust in power structures, in authority figures, in the experts, quote unquote. Increase, even me saying quote unquote there. I'm just going to turn this light off because it's getting a bit epic. Increasing distrust in power structures, increasing destructive skepticism and criticism in the negative sense, just sort of destroying and not really giving anything in replacement of that. An increase in alienation and isolation, especially in lockdown times. Increase in abundance, materially and in terms of knowledge, and an increase in rapid rates of change, all contribute in threats to meaning and therefore to the feelings of pessimism, to feelings of nihilism. And so we shall conclude there. I am very sorry. That was 2 hours and 40 minutes. I did go over it as a practice run and tried to reduce it. And my practice run, it only went for like an hour and a half. It wasn't that long. But I have a habit of trying to reduce it. And then when it comes to actually doing it, ends up taking a million times longer. So let's have a look. So there's still, mashallah, there's still 20 of you here. May Allah bless the 20 of you that managed to make it through. Jazakallah khair for joining us today. So just to kind of recap, the whole point of this, we're going to get to these answers. We're going to start to deal with these problems towards the final lecture, especially. So just, again, keep in mind, I keep telling people patience is important here. So you need to have patience. And inshallah, I hope you're recognizing the value of that. And inshallah, you are seeking some sort of, or you're finding some sort of benefit in these lectures. So I'm just going to engage with any questions that you have, or if you just want to share any particular opinions at the moment. Let me have a look. We'll see what you have to say. Do you have advice? Do you advise us to start with first before watching this second lecture? Okay, you probably asked that at the beginning. I'm guessing it's a bit late to answer that now. I don't think it really matters. I think you can watch this and then go and watch the first. Obviously, it's ideal if you watch the first and then the second. But it's not necessary. And I don't think you're necessarily going to kind of do yourself over. I cannot hear anything. I hope. Yes, the first lecture, I did mention this at the beginning. They are going to be posted on the website, sapiensinstitute.org, and on the Sapience Institute YouTube channel. So they will be present. So when truth doesn't suit the individual desires, pessimistic thinking comes into play and leads to nihilism. Let me just read that again. So when truth doesn't suit the individual's desires, pessimistic thinking comes into play and then leads to nihilism. Not necessarily, because they could even be thinking that they are on truth. The thing is there's certain axioms that are being neglected here. They've sort of began with certain principles that they've not questioned, and they've moved forward. They're experiencing some sort of pessimism, and then they are finding truth in the world. So it's not that it doesn't suit their desires. It might even be that it's counter to their desires. It might even be that it's they want something and they can't achieve that, and the fact that they can't achieve that is a truth, and they're being revealed to this truth, and they're submitting themselves to that truth, and that leads to this pessimism. So it's not necessarily that it's you've got to keep in mind that there are countless truths. There are loads of truths. There's a truth about an indefinite amount of things just in one bedroom, or in just within a meter of you. There are so many truths we can talk about on many different layers and many different scales. So the idea of truth is a complex one, because it's multifaceted and we can talk about it indefinitely. And so you can point out there are particular truths, but there are some truths which are important and require your attention. But there are some truths that really don't require your attention at all. And like for example, who cares how many hairs are on every human being on planet Earth? There's a truth to that. There is an answer to that question. We could go out there and count every single hair on every single person's body and try to come up with some sort of estimate. But like, who really cares about the answer to that? What kind of truth is that? It is a truth. Is it a valuable one? Is it one we need to know? No. And there's countless truths like that, useless truths, truths that really don't have no value or function or purpose, and you don't really need to know them. And you know, that's one kind of truth. And there's truths that, you know, when you find them out, maybe get in the way of a particular desire, or maybe even fall in line with a desire. But either way, there's still millions of other truths we can be concerned with. And so, you know, the truth can be something that leads to nihilism. And that's in isolation, neglecting loads of other truths, but there is particular truths that may lead to nihilism. So it's not to say that it's falsehood that leads to nihilism. It's not the case at all. It might literally just be ignorance in many cases. So there's all these other truths you're unaware of, ignorant of, blah, 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 blah. You focus on particular things and you move in a particular direction, and you end up in nihilism in some form, or some severe sense of pessimism. So moral relativism can justify murder, rape, lying, theft, and all types of things that we see as crimes, as long as a society values and accommodates these crimes into culture and tradition and see them to be right. So there are examples of certain cultures that, for example, thought highly of cannibalism. So, you know, they would eat their dead, or they would have strange practices. So it's not completely out there. In terms of murder, rape, things like that, you know, you saw this sort of being expressed with certain colonial ideas. Lying, theft, yeah, it's even like, so you've got this whole question then with regards to moral relativism. Where do you draw the line? What do you refer to as a society? So let's say you look at the pirates in the Caribbean, where they sort of splinter off, start to make their own society. Do you consider them as being part of the societies that they rebelled against? Or do you start to consider them their own society? And let's say they create Pleasure Island, like in Pinocchio, where they get to do whatever they want. What happens to these norms? What happens when these societies begin to overlap, or they begin to clash and meet at the borders? One society is a colonial one. You think of the British Empire conquering India, and they say, this is our land. We are morally superior. They are morally inferior. And it is good that we conquer them and teach them our ways and make them more British and blah, 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 blah. Yeah, obviously, these are all assumptions, but within the framework of moral relativism, and so far as that society sees what they're doing as good, it is good. But let's say India doesn't like that. Let's say India thinks that, no, we don't really want the British coming over here doing that, taking our resources, enslaving our populace, blah, 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 blah. They're not into that. From a moral relativist perspective, that is simultaneously a bad thing, is they consider it immoral. That society considers it immoral. But now you've got this moral system, this ethical moral system, which is claiming that it is good and bad, that these people do these things. And so you end up with these conflicts that seem to be unresolvable in certain circumstances, or that just make morality again seem sort of arbitrary and start leading you towards a sort of moral nihilism, in the sense that they can't all be right, or they might all be wrong. This moral game is just a silly one. So yeah, and you can get that, and it can end up being justified by culture and things like that. Another question. Johnson took over after Kennedy's assassination, perhaps that's why nobody trusted him. Okay. Do pessimists and nihilists have major trust issues? Yeah, I would say so. That's very true. I think it's called Twitter brain. People have very short attention spans. Yeah. Twitter is another really good example of that. You know, the 150 character limit. You're trying to get everyone's attention in that one tweet. Second, you move onto a thread. The further down the thread you go, the less attention the thread gets. You can even see that in the expression of the likes in a thread. The first tweet in a thread always has more likes, and most of the time, as you go down, progressively gets less and less and less and less. So you'll get the odd person that'll like everyone because he's read everyone, and then you'll get people maybe they're liking a couple and they get bored and so on out. Yeah. So, what is the name of the book where the story of the man searching for God occurs? The Gay Science. All societies today were built on religious foundations, so trying to replace the foundation of a society will cause building blocks to fall. Yeah, it's like kicking someone's feet out from underneath them. That's very interesting. Meaning in education. I do believe that a lack of meaning in context is why students don't want to learn anymore. Yeah, and again, usually studying, I find, in university especially, is characteristic of an escapism. So that is, they don't really want to go out into the world. They're afraid of becoming an adult or independent completely, and they sort of see going to uni as a way of putting that off. There's a number of things. They get quote unquote free money, so they get the student loans, and these student loans are often referred to as free money. They get a sort of independence where they get to live on their own in a flat. It's the first time where they get to be, relatively independent, but then they can always run back home if they want to. They don't necessarily even take their studies that seriously. This is a huge problem with university culture, and half of the time they're spending a lot of their money that they get within the first couple of weeks and then living like paupers for the rest of the term and struggling. These are, again, common issues with the education system, and it sort of makes the education meaningless because they're not doing it with a grander goal in mind all the time. It's just, I don't really know what to do, I'm going to pick this, to sort of put off having to make an absolute decision. Obviously, there's always going to be exceptions to the case. Modern education actually compounds this problem of diversification in content and becoming a jack of all trade. It does not encourage zooming in our child's specific talent and aptitude and encouraging mastery. I agree. The result is students who are overwhelmed, they find no meaning in their learning, and they are increasingly depressed and anxious about that. Yes, it's a great point. And this is extremely expressive of like primary school learning. Let's teach them everything, a little bit of everything: geography, religion. And religion itself is such a vast subject, but it's like religious studies. Let's throw every religion out there into that 1 hour lesson a week. And then we'll give them a really awkward teacher that everyone seems to not like. It's just like, what are you expecting? It has this sense of meaninglessness because they're trying to cover so much ground with it. So nihilism is also the result of not finding a replacement to something that has been taken away from a pessimistic thinker. Yes, it's nihilism is a void. So even Nietzsche wasn't an absolute nihilist in the sense he didn't see it as an end goal. He saw it as a transitionary stage, something to overcome, something to go through, but to get out the other end and then create something new, like a phoenix out of the flames sort of thing. But yeah, nihilism is basically a void. It's the removal of anything, the removal of a structure and the leaving of a rubble, a ruin, or a blank slate in its place. Skepticism would basically drive people mad because they have endless possibilities to do anything and everything. Yes. How do you counter extreme skepticism? You just point it back at itself. So if someone is in the extreme skepticism position, you just cut to the chase and you say, well, let's just begin with pointing it at itself. And obviously, if they hold extreme skepticism as a highest value, you would just go through the process of it turning its sting upon itself and say, so, all right, let's say it is something really important. You need to be extremely skeptical of absolutely everything. So do we include extreme skepticism within that? I mean, get them to go through the process of being skeptical about their extreme skepticism. And then eventually, inshallah, I found it very useful. They should see that there are reasons to be skeptical of extreme skepticism, and that it does have its uses, but it can also be very useless in some cases, and that you need to try to decide, what's the point on this? Is the skepticism in this particular regard useful? Am I being reasonable in putting forward? So I was talking to a brother recently, and we had a really funny conversation. about this lad who wanted to debate a scholar, and he was really young, and he was like, "Oh, let's debate about whether or not we exist," and blah blah blah. And the scholar was just like, "No, I'm not wasting my time with that." He's like, "Why? Because you're scared. You're scared. You don't want to debate me because you're scared." And he's like, "So what do you want me to do?" He's like, "You want me to get up on the stage in front of all these people and debate you and say, 'Hello, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the stadium. Today the argument, I'm going to try to do is to convince you all that you all exist and that you all are sitting here listening to me. And this young man here is going to try and convince you all that you might not exist and that you're not here. Well, what's the point of that?" And then he asked him another question. He was like, is it possible that you could be Spider-Man and that you forgot?" And having this sort of extremely skeptical mindset, he's like, "Yeah, it is possible." And it's like, "Oh, so how can you go on living and blah blah blah? Like, how can you commit to many things if that's a possibility? What shouldn't you be trying to get to the truth of whether or not that is the case or isn't the case? Do we need to write it off?" It gets to a point where it becomes absurd and really silly in certain cases, and it's just the point of showing them when it becomes absurd or when it goes too far. So what would a skeptic say about natural inclinations and needs of a human being? Let me just check the time. I'll try and get a couple more. If you told an extreme skeptic to not drink water for a whole month, I guarantee they would not be able to do it. Yeah, no, they would die within a week, probably. I don't know what they would say. It's a good question. I think it's just proof that they can't commit to it absolutely. That necessity would kick in, and they'd have to stop being skeptical with a particular regard. It's why people are only absolutely skeptical when it suits them, but they're never absolutely skeptical. Societies today have been weaponized and robotized to follow whatever is in the interest of a few individuals. What do animal laborans mean? It means a labouring animal. Alhamdulillah, still here and eagerly listening. May Allah bless you all. Right, there's 15 of you, and there's quite a lot of questions here. So what I'll do is I'll just scroll right to the bottom, and I'll have a look at what you guys are saying at the bottom, just as a little reward for spending so much time listening to me ramble on. So what would encourage homeschooling rather than would you encourage, is what you meant to say, homeschooling rather than state school? What is your opinion on private education, privately educating one's child? In your opinion, which would you recommend more, homeschooling or private education schools? I think ideally, if you could get them into an Islamic school, that would probably be the best. The question with homeschooling is are you going to be able to do the job properly? Can you, and who's doing it? Is the father going to stay home and make sure that that's being done properly? Is the mother's going to be doing it? And can you confirm that they will be doing a good job at educating? There's a lot of stress on the parents already. And if you put 100% of the work onto the parents and the parents alone, especially on subjects they might not even be familiar with, or might not even be trained to educate their children. Homeschooling works if you have parents with the will and the drive to learn the things that they need to teach, first of all, and then the ability to be able to do so. So you've got to ask these questions. You've got to be serious about them. Are you capable of doing it? If you are, and you have the drive and the will, then do it. If you're not, then consider education, but make sure you're picking it properly. So you want to look at, say, an Islamic school if there's one nearby. If there isn't an Islamic school nearby, then you've got a number of questions you've got to ask. Do we try to move to somewhere where there is one? Do we make hijrah? Do we go back to like a Muslim country? Or do we make do with what's available? Do we try to put them into a public education here? But then again, you've got to be careful, and you've got to, maybe some people don't have any option, and unfortunately that's the case for a few people. And they have to put them into a school that they don't even like, knowing that these kids are going to be taught something that they don't agree with. In that case, you need to be prepared and ready to offer counter education to things that we would consider problematic. But it's complex. Maybe you could answer the good question in a live stream someday. Yeah, I'm still trying to figure out if it's possible to pull up these questions. after the live streams ended. So I'm not sure about that, but it's a good question. Because I would like to, if I can get a document with all of these on, I might just do like a private live stream and just answering them. But leave that with me. I'll have to speak to Hamza to see if that's possible. Maybe you could answer. I'll just read that one. Regarding what you mentioned, the rapid rates of change, where, for example, after 50 years of life, learning and honing a talent only to be wasted. Interesting that this could be. Interesting that this could potentially lead to pessimism and nihilism. It seems contemporary society is leading to elderly generations leading to the same pessimistic and nihilistic conditions, psychopath. Yeah, it's a nasty feedback loop. Came across an article yesterday in the English language as now having lost predominant majority. It not all positive lexis in its language. Sorry, I'm not too sure what you meant with that last point, Samir. I came across an article yesterday on the English language as now having lost predominant majority. It's not all positive lexis in its language. I'm not sure what you meant by that exactly. So could you just reconfirm what you meant there? Mashallah, great lecture. Spoke to the disgruntled teenager. We never really managed to shed. Well, yeah. And inshallah, I'm guessing I think you mentioned that earlier, maybe. May Allah guide the disgruntled teenager. Does scientism lead to nihilism? Yes, I would say it probably does. Scientism in the sense that it's something that kind of it's another high. If scientism is like a higher value, it's another one of them that undermines itself and then leads. If a value undermines itself and leaves nothing in its place, that is what we would refer to as nihilism. Barakallahu fikum wa fikum. Assalamu alaikum wa alaikum salam. Your course is awesome. But I can't listen to it in one shot. I need to split. Yeah, that's fine. These things I could expect that not everyone's going to be able to go through all of them in one go. I did intend to make them smaller, but they end up being huge because I jibber jabber way too much. Will recordings be available for your course? Yes, it will be. If not, could you please? I say, yeah, no, they will make them available. They'll be present on the website and on the Sapience Institute YouTube channel. You gave us extra time, alhamdulillah. Yes, for teens choosing career paths now, I tell them to choose something that a robot or computer can't replace. Yes. This kind of leads into creative endeavors. So some things like artistic, even older trades, funnily enough, are coming back because people like the uniqueness of them. So like homemade items, knitted quilts, things like that. There's a niceness about the unique roughness in a homemade product. Yes, for teens choosing, yeah, so a computer can't replace because that's the harsh reality of the fourth industrial revolution, unfortunately. Time reminder. Sorry, I've only just saw that now. Jazakallah khair. Yes, you can have access to the presentation later. I'm going to leave it at that because it's already been way over 3 hours now. Oh, not way over, but a little bit over 3 hours. So we'll leave it there. Yes, you can have the presentation later. They're going to be uploaded to the Sapience Institute website as well. But other than that, thank you to the 14 of you that have managed to stay all the way through. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you all. Barakallahu feek. And stay tuned for next week where we'll continue with these lectures, inshallah. Other than that, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.